The Greek world of the early 5th century BCE existed as a mosaic of small, self-governing communities whose independence shaped every aspect of their political and cultural life. Each polis functioned as a compact society centered on an urban core, surrounding farms, and a shared sense of communal belonging. Archaeological evidence suggests that these polis emerged gradually from the fragmented conditions of the Greek Dark Ages. During that earlier period, populations were dispersed across small villages with limited political structure. By the 8th century BCE, these settlements consolidated into urban centers, establishing councils, magistracies, and codified laws that defined citizenship and civic responsibility. This development marked one of the most significant transitions in ancient Mediterranean history, the movement from kin-based tribal authority to structured civic governance. Across the Aegean, polis differed in size, wealth, and political form, yet they shared language, religion, and a common cultural heritage. Panhellenic festivals, such as those at Olympia and Delphi, reinforced the idea of Greekness, even as competition among polis remained intense. This collective identity rested not on political unity, but on mutual recognition of shared traditions, mythic ancestry, and social norms. Despite this, the autonomy of each polis remained paramount. The right to make independent decisions about war, alliances, and internal governance was viewed as essential to its identity. This emphasis on self-rule created a landscape in which cooperation was possible, but long-term unity was rare. Among the hundreds of polis, two stood out for their exceptional scale and ideological clarity. Athens developed into a maritime power driven by commerce and an expanding citizen body. Its democratic reforms reorganized political participation around the collective decision-making of free male citizens, giving a broad segment of society a direct role in governance. This structure encouraged intellectual experimentation, artistic advancement, and economic initiative. The city's growing fleet protected trade routes and projected Athenian influence across the Aegean, tying its prosperity to the sea. In contrast, Sparta shaped its society around a disciplined military culture grounded in land power. Its political system balanced kings, councils, and assemblies within a rigid social hierarchy that emphasized stability over innovation. Spartan citizenship required lifelong dedication to communal defense, supported by a controlled helot population that sustained agricultural production. This model produced a highly trained army admired throughout the Greek world, but left little room for the cultural diversity found in other polis. The contrasting priorities of these two states, economic dynamism versus structural austerity, reflected fundamentally different visions of how a polis should function. The Persian Wars momentarily brought these contrasting societies into alignment, as external threat compelled cooperation. Yet, even during their shared campaigns, the ideological divisions between them remained evident. Athens saw victory as proof of the strength of democratic participation and naval mastery, while Sparta interpreted the conflict as validation of disciplined land warfare and traditional order. Once the Persian threat receded, these differing interpretations shaped each state's expectations for leadership in the Greek world. The underlying tension between their political systems made sustained unity unlikely. By understanding how the polis developed and how Greek identity functioned within a decentralized landscape, it becomes clear why Athens and Sparta approached power so differently. Their shared culture offered common ground, but their incompatible structures and ambitions created a trajectory toward rivalry. This foundational contrast sets the stage for examining how Athens transformed its wartime leadership into a far-reaching maritime empire, accelerating the divide that would define the Greek world in the decades ahead. In the aftermath of the Greek victory over Persia, the balance of influence within the Hellenic world shifted decisively toward Athens. The destruction left by the invasions had revealed the vulnerability of the Aegean, and many island and coastal communities sought reliable protection. Athens possessed the most advanced naval force in Greece, a fleet that had proven indispensable at Salamis and now operated as a symbol of collective security. In 478 BCE, representatives from numerous polis gathered on the sacred island of Delos to establish a defensive alliance against any future Persian incursions. This Delian League began as a voluntary coalition in which each member contributed either warships or monetary tribute, calculated through a standardized assessment overseen by the Athenian statesman Aristides. The league's structure implicitly acknowledged Athens' naval leadership, yet it retained the language of partnership and mutual defense. Over the following decades, Athens used this position to consolidate authority over its allies. The size of the Athenian fleet allowed it to patrol vast stretches of the Aegean, enabling it to intervene quickly in disputes, enforce tribute payments, and suppress dissent. Archaeological and textual evidence indicates that by 460 BCE Athens controlled nearly 300 triremes, giving it unparalleled mobility and strategic reach. The alliance's transformation became unmistakable when Naxos attempted to withdraw around 470 BCE. Athens responded with a siege, forcing the island back into the league and dismantling its fortifications. This action demonstrated that membership, once voluntary, had become compulsory. From that point, Athens treated secession as a challenge to its authority rather than an acceptable political decision. As the league grew more centralized, its administrative center shifted as well. In 454 BCE, the treasury moved from Delos to Athens, placed under Athenian guardianship with the justification of safeguarding the funds during renewed tensions with Persia. In practice, this transfer marked a decisive turning point. Control over the tribute allowed Athens to direct financial resources toward its own civic and architectural projects. Under the leadership of Pericles, a portion of the league's revenue financed the reconstruction of the Acropolis, including monumental structures such as the Parthenon. These projects reflected Athens' self-image as the cultural leader of the Greek world, supported by tribute that allied states increasingly viewed as obligatory taxation. By the mid-5th century BCE, Athenian influence extended across the Aegean through a network of allied states, garrisons, and cleriches, settlements of Athenian citizens placed on foreign soil to secure local compliance and expand Athenian landholdings. Standardized Athenian coinage and legal procedures were imposed on various members, further integrating them into a system shaped around Athenian interests. Tribute lists from this period indicate annual contributions reaching approximately 600 talents, an extraordinary sum that provided Athens with sustained economic growth and funded its naval operations, festivals, and public payments for civic participation. This prosperity strengthened Athenian democracy, yet it deepened the resentment of allies who increasingly perceived the League as an imperial structure rather than a mutual alliance. Sparta observed this expansion with growing concern. Its leaders recognized that Athenian control of the sea altered the strategic landscape established after the Persian Wars. A state defined by land power and internal discipline now faced a rival whose wealth, allies, and fleet extended its influence far beyond its original borders. As Athenian policies became more assertive, the ideological divide between the two leading Greek states widened further. Understanding why Sparta viewed this maritime empire as an existential threat requires turning to the social foundations and military ethos that shaped Spartan decision-making in the years ahead. Sparta entered the 5th century BCE as a society shaped by circumstances unique within the Greek world. The conquest of Messenia in the 7th century BCE had created a dependent population of Helots who farmed the land and supported the Spartan economy. These Helots outnumbered the Spartan citizenry by a wide margin, a demographic reality that defined every aspect of Spartan governance. Fear of revolt required constant readiness, strict discipline, and social structures designed to maintain control. To prevent uprisings, Spartan authorities authorized an annual declaration of war against the Helots, allowing the Cryptia, an institution functioning as a form of secret police, to eliminate individuals suspected of resistance. This system reinforced a culture of surveillance and intimidation, ensuring that the agricultural base supporting the Spartan state remained firmly contained. To sustain this model, Sparta developed the Aegoge, a rigorous state-run education and training system for boys beginning at age 7. The Aegoge emphasized physical endurance, combat skills, and unquestioning obedience to the collective needs of the polis. Young Spartans were taught to endure hardship, cooperate within disciplined units, and subordinate personal desires to the requirements of military cohesion. By age 20, they entered formal military service, joining the ranks of the hoplite phalanx, an infantry formation that demanded unity, precision, and courage. Full citizenship was not granted until age 30, reinforcing the expectation that loyalty, discipline, and military competence were prerequisites for political participation. This system produced soldiers renowned across Greece for their effectiveness in close-quarters combat and their ability to maintain formation under pressure. Sparta's military strength extended beyond its own borders through the Peloponnesian League, a coalition of states bound to Sparta through bilateral treaties. Unlike the tribute-based Delian League dominated by Athens, the Peloponnesian League functioned through mutual obligations. Members provided troops rather than financial payments and retained control over their internal affairs. League councils offered a platform where allied states could express concerns, although Sparta's leadership remained unquestioned. This alliance network emphasized land warfare, reflecting the strategic priorities of Sparta and its allies. The coalition proved vital in maintaining regional balance, particularly as Athenian influence expanded across the Aegean. Sparta's foreign policy was closely tied to its internal social structure. Leaders viewed democratic governments in allied or neighboring polis as potential threats because they might inspire Helot demands for greater autonomy. As a result, Sparta frequently supported oligarchic regimes and intervened to suppress democratic movements. Its society valued stability, order, and continuity, resisting cultural and economic changes that other Greek states embraced. The focus on agriculture, combined with limited engagement in trade or maritime activity, fostered a degree of isolation that set Sparta apart from the commercial dynamism of Athens. By the mid-5th century BCE, the Peloponnesian League included powerful states such as Corinth, Thebes, and much of mainland Greece, creating a formidable land-based counterweight to the Athenian maritime empire. The contrasting systems of Athens and Sparta, one outward-looking and naval, the other inward-focused and militarized, represented two incompatible models of power. With both alliances firmly established, the geopolitical landscape of Greece had become increasingly polarized. This polarization set the conditions in which specific disputes, diplomatic failures, and regional conflicts would escalate a long-standing rivalry into open warfare, requiring closer examination of the events that brought these competing systems into direct confrontation. The decade preceding the Peloponnesian War revealed how regional disputes could merge into a broader crisis once the major Greek powers aligned themselves behind competing interests. The first confrontation emerged at Corcyra, a strategically positioned naval power with a fleet rivaled only by Athens. When a civil dispute in the colony of Epidamnus escalated into open conflict between Corcyra and its mother city Corinth in 435 BCE, Corcyra sought external support. Its appeal to Athens in 433 BCE presented a challenging decision. Athens understood that allowing Corinth, a key member of the Peloponnesian League, to control Corcyra's fleet would shift the naval balance. Accepting a defensive alliance with Corcyra offered security but risked antagonizing Corinth. Athens ultimately chose alliance, sending ships that helped restrain Corinthian forces at the Battle of Sabota. Although the engagement was indecisive, Corcyra preserved its fleet, and Corinth interpreted Athenian intervention as a direct threat, demanding Spartan attention. A second flashpoint developed around Potidaea, a city in the northern Aegean with dual ties. It was a Corinthian colony, but a paying member of the Athenian alliance. In 432 BCE, Athens ordered Potidaea to dismantle its fortifications and dismiss Corinthian magistrates to prevent rebellion. Corinthian influence in the region alarmed Athens, which sought to secure its northern trade routes and maintain control over tribute-paying states. Potidaea's refusal, encouraged by covert assurances from Sparta, led to a revolt. Athens responded with a siege, deepening Corinthian hostility and reinforcing the perception that Athens intended to extend its authority by force. The third incident involved Megara, whose position on the Isthmus of Corinth made it strategically significant. Around 432 BCE, Athens enacted the Megarian decree, excluding Megarian merchants from Athenian markets and harbors controlled by the Delian League. This decision, presented as punishment for harboring escaped slaves and violating sacred land, functioned as an economic embargo. For a small polis dependent on trade, the decree was severe. Within the Peloponnesian League, the measure was viewed as an unprovoked attack on a member state and a violation of the commercial freedoms expected under the 30 Years' Peace. These disputes converged at Sparta, where Corinthian ambassadors insisted that failure to confront Athens would destabilize the league. Sparta's assembly, influenced by Allied pressure and long-standing anxiety about Athenian expansion, declared that Athens had breached the peace treaty. Although diplomatic missions continued, each side insisted on terms the other would not accept. Athens refused to repeal the Megarian decree or loosen its hold on Allied states. Sparta rejected any arrangement that acknowledged Athenian dominance. With negotiations stalled, both alliances prepared for conflict. This breakdown of diplomacy set the stage for a war in which strategic assumptions on both sides would determine the shape of its opening campaigns. When open war began in the spring of 431 BCE, Athens faced a fundamental strategic dilemma. Its strength lay in its fleet, commercial networks, and fortified urban center, while Sparta dominated land warfare with the most disciplined infantry force in Greece. Pericles, the preeminent Athenian statesman of the era, recognized that confronting the Spartan army in a traditional hoplite battle would risk the destruction of Athens' citizen force. Instead, he articulated a strategy that rejected long-held Greek assumptions about how wars should be fought. Pericles proposed that Athens avoid major land engagements, preserve its fleet, and use its maritime reach to damage Peloponnesian coastal settlements. To support this plan, the population of Attica was ordered to abandon rural homes and farms, moving behind the long walls that connected Athens to Piraeus. These massive fortifications created a secure corridor to the sea, ensuring that as long as the navy held control of the Aegean, the city could not be starved into submission. This approach required considerable sacrifice. Farms, orchards, and vineyards that had been cultivated for generations were left undefended as tens of thousands of rural inhabitants crowded into Athens. The city, designed for a much smaller population, quickly became overburdened. Makeshift shelters filled open spaces, sanctuaries, and even the area beneath the Acropolis. The sudden influx strained water supplies and sanitation systems, while the reliance on imported grain made Athens increasingly dependent on maritime trade routes. Despite these hardships, Pericles maintained that the city's financial reserves, including an annual income of approximately 600 talents from Allied tribute, would sustain the war effort. Athenian naval superiority allowed periodic raids on Peloponnesian territory, demonstrating that Sparta could inflict damage on Attica but could not isolate or conquer Athens itself. The first Spartan invasion under King Archidamus II in May 431 BC tested this strategy immediately. Spartan forces advanced through Attica, burning crops and destroying rural settlements. For citizens watching from the walls, the experience was psychologically devastating. Hoplite warfare traditionally emphasized direct confrontation, and many Athenians expected their army to defend their land. Pericles, however, insisted that engaging Sparta on land would jeopardize the entire war effort. The Athenian army remained inside the city while smoke from burning farms filled the countryside. Public frustration increased and political pressure mounted, but Pericles held to his plan. In 430 BCE, this fragile situation collapsed under the impact of an unexpected disaster. A virulent plague entered Athens, likely through Piraeus, where commercial traffic remained active. The disease, whose precise nature remains debated among medical historians, spread rapidly among the densely packed population. Thucydides, an Athenian general and the war's principal historian, left a detailed account after surviving the illness. He described high fevers, inflammation of the eyes and throat, severe thirst, gastrointestinal distress, and rapid death within a week for many sufferers. Traditional religious appeals offered no relief, and the failure of rituals and sacrifices undermined public confidence in the gods. The scale of mortality was immense. Modern estimates suggest that between 75,000 and 100,000 people died over successive waves from 430 to 426 BCE, including a significant portion of the city's hoplites and rowers. The loss of manpower affected both military operations and everyday civic functions. Morale collapsed as families perished and social norms deteriorated under the strain of mass death. The psychological impact was intensified by the realization that the plague struck only within the crowded city. Those who remained in the countryside had largely evacuated, yet the rural destruction caused by Spartan invasions continued. Pericles himself succumbed to the disease in 429 BCE, depriving Athens of the leader best equipped to maintain strategic coherence. His death left a vacuum that ambitious political figures soon filled. Many of these leaders favored more aggressive action, arguing that morale demanded visible victories and that the city needed to assert its power to counter the chaos brought by disease. With the protective caution of Pericles removed, Athens began to deviate from the restraint that had defined its early war strategy. This shift laid the foundation for increasingly bold military initiatives as the conflict entered its next phase. Athens entered the middle years of the war weakened by plague, but still in possession of the factor that defined its military identity: overwhelming naval superiority. The Athenian fleet, built around fast triremes powered by 170 well-trained oarsmen, enabled operations that no land power could counter. These ships excelled at complex maneuvers such as the deeplis, in which an attacking vessel pierced an enemy line and struck from behind, and the periplis, a flanking movement designed to encircle slower opponents. Such techniques required discipline, coordination, and experience acquired through constant training, advantages that Peloponnesian crews lacked. Even at moments when the city suffered internal crisis, the fleet remained fully operational, supported by allied tribute and a maritime network that ensured a steady flow of resources to Piraeus. The early naval campaigns demonstrated how decisively seamanship could shape regional power. In 429 BCE, the Athenian commander Phormio confronted Peloponnesian fleets attempting to challenge Athenian control in the Corinthian Gulf. With only 20 triremes, Phormio defeated forces nearly 4 times his size at Patrae and Naupactus. His crews maintained tight formations, executed rapid turns, and exploited wind conditions that hindered the heavier Corinthian ships. The result was a series of engagements in which Athens destroyed or captured many enemy vessels while suffering no losses of its own. These victories preserved Athenian access to Western trade routes and reinforced the perception that Athens, despite plague and political instability, remained the uncontested naval power of Greece. A more dramatic shift in the war's momentum occurred in 425 BCE through a combination of accident, opportunity, and tactical innovation. The Athenian general Demosthenes, en route to Sicily, was blown off course by adverse weather and sought refuge at Pylos, a naturally defensible harbor on the Messenian coast. Recognizing its strategic value, he fortified the headland with improvised defenses. Sparta reacted quickly, aware that an Athenian outpost in Messenia threatened the heart of its Helot population and endangered internal security. Spartan forces gathered to expel the Athenians, while a naval contingent attempted to control the surrounding waters. In the ensuing clashes, Athenian sailors outmaneuvered the Spartan fleet, forcing a group of roughly 420 Spartan hoplites onto nearby Sphacteria Island. As the siege tightened, the situation became unprecedented. Spartan forces attempted repeated resupply missions but faced constant harassment from Athenian ships. Weeks passed with little progress, and the stranded hoplites suffered from limited provisions and deteriorating morale. The Athenians then launched an amphibious assault combining light-armed troops and archers, who exploited the island's rough terrain. Heavily armored Spartans, trained for close formation combat on open ground, found themselves vulnerable to continuous missile attacks. After heavy casualties, approximately 128 killed, the remaining 292 surrendered. The surrender of 120 Spartiates, full Spartan citizens, shocked the Greek world. Spartan society emphasized endurance and death before capitulation, and the loss of elite warriors struck at the foundation of its military reputation. Athens quickly recognized the leverage this provided. The prisoners served as powerful hostages. Any renewed Spartan invasion of Attica risked their execution. As a result, for several years Sparta curtailed its annual incursions, attempting instead to negotiate terms for their release. Confident in its position, Athens increased tribute assessments in 425 BCE and pressed for greater assertiveness across the empire. Yet the Spartan state, though shaken, was not inert. The defeat at Pylos encouraged the search for commanders capable of countering Athenian flexibility. From this need emerged Brasidas, a leader whose campaigns in northern Greece would demonstrate that the Peloponnesian League could operate effectively far beyond the traditional constraints of hoplite warfare. Leadership in the Aegean War had largely followed predictable patterns, Sparta dominant on land, Athens unchallenged at sea, until the emergence of a figure who refused to conform to either side's expectations. Brasidas, a Spartan officer distinguished not only by courage but by political intelligence rare in his city's rigid military culture, recognized that the war could not be won by ravaging Attica year after year. He understood something far more dangerous. The Athenian Empire looked stable only from a distance. Beneath its surface, resentment simmered among subject allies who paid tribute, surrendered local autonomy, and lived under the constant threat of Athenian intervention. If Sparta could speak to that discontent, the war's geography and its outcome could be transformed. In 424 BCE, Brasidas set out to test this theory. Leading a small but agile force of roughly 1,700 men, including Helots granted freedom for their service, he marched north into Thrace and Macedonia. This was not a random theater. Thrace formed the economic heart of the Athenian war effort. Timber for shipbuilding, silver from the mines at Pangaeum, and the grain routes entering the Aegean through the Strymon Valley all passed through this region. To threaten Thrace was to strike at the economic bloodstream of the Athenian fleet. Brasidas' campaign aimed not at spectacular battles, but at undermining the imperial infrastructure that allowed Athens to fight at sea indefinitely. What set Brasidas apart was his understanding that military pressure alone would not achieve this goal. At Acanthus, Torone, and other northern cities, he offered something far more attractive than another shifting allegiance in Greek interstate politics. He promised autonomy, an end to tribute, and a liberation framed in the language Athens had long used to justify its own hegemony. His reputation for honor amplified the appeal. Unlike most Spartan commanders, he respected local customs, avoided unnecessary brutality, and spoke to civic leaders as partners rather than subordinates. Cities defected not out of fear, but out of hope that a Spartan alliance under Brasidas might restore a political independence they had not enjoyed for decades. His boldest achievement came at Amphipolis, the linchpin of Athenian power in the north. Controlling the crossing of the Strymon River and access to precious resources, Amphipolis was indispensable to Athens' naval economy. When Brasidas advanced on the city, the Athenian general Thucydides, later the war's historian, rushed from Thassos with a small fleet, but arrived too late. By offering moderate terms and guaranteeing safety, Brasidas persuaded the city to surrender without the devastation customary in Greek sieges. Amphipolis' loss was a strategic earthquake. Athens had not merely lost a stronghold, but had revealed the fragility of its imperial cohesion. Over the following year, Brasidas' presence triggered a cascade of defections across the region. His campaign required no grand battles. He succeeded by exposing a fundamental truth. An empire maintained through coercion alone cannot forever secure the loyalty of those who bear its burdens. By 423 BCE, the cumulative strain forced both Athens and Sparta to agree to the Truce of Laches. Yet the truce reflected not mutual trust, but mutual exhaustion, and the growing awareness in Athens that Brasidas' continued freedom of action threatened the very foundation of their empire. Brasidas' northern successes convinced Athens that the war could not be allowed to drift further in Sparta's favor. The next phase would bring desperate efforts to reclaim lost territory and to stop the one commander capable of reshaping the war's strategic landscape, culminating in the clash at Amphipolis that neither side could afford to lose. In early 422 BCE, Athens undertook a decisive operation to regain control of Amphipolis and reverse the successes achieved by Brasidas in Thrace. The city dispatched Cleon, a prominent populist politician known for his aggressive stance on prosecuting the war, with a force of approximately 1,200 hoplites and 300 cavalry. Despite his political prominence, Cleon's military experience was limited. His previous involvement in the region had been largely ceremonial. At Pylos, tactical victories were engineered by subordinate generals, including Demosthenes, rather than by Cleon himself. Nevertheless, Athens viewed him as a figure capable of restoring confidence and reversing the psychological damage caused by Spartan victories in the north. Cleon's approach to Amphipolis, however, revealed the dangers of inexperience. His reconnaissance of the city's defenses was cursory, and he underestimated both the skill of Brasidas and the loyalty of Amphipolis' garrison. Brasidas, commanding approximately 2,000 men within the city, observed the Athenian movements and devised a countermeasure exploiting Cleon's overextension. In a coordinated assault, he deployed troops simultaneously through two city gates, striking the Athenian left and center wings unexpectedly. The attack disoriented Cleon's forces. The left wing collapsed almost immediately, and Cleon himself, attempting to rally his men, was killed by a Thracian peltast. Although the Athenian right wing managed to maintain cohesion and inflicted mortal wounds on Brasidas, the overall engagement was catastrophic for Athens. Casualties numbered roughly 600, while Spartan losses were minimal, only 7 confirmed. The psychological impact exceeded the numerical one. Athens lost its most fervent advocate for the war, and Sparta its most capable commander, a leader whose combination of strategy and diplomacy had reshaped the northern theater. The simultaneous deaths of these two commanders created a political and strategic vacuum conducive to peace negotiations. In Athens, Nicias, a wealthy conservative statesman long advocating for restraint and compromise, rose to prominence. His political philosophy emphasized caution, fiscal stability, and avoidance of further military overreach. In Sparta, King Pleistouanax shared a similar inclination, motivated both by the loss of Brasidas and the practical need to recover the 292 hostages held by Athens since the capture at Pylos. Negotiations proceeded for months, culminating in the Peace of Nicias, ratified in March 421 BCE. The treaty stipulated a return of captured prisoners, restoration of pre-war territorial holdings, and a formal alliance intended to last 50 years. On paper, the agreement promised stability, yet underlying structural flaws were immediately apparent. Several factors ensured the peace would be fragile. Many of Sparta's key allies, particularly Corinth and Thebes, refused to ratify the treaty, perceiving it as a betrayal of their interests. Athens, despite the formal agreement, failed to regain Amphipolis, where local populations and veteran forces loyal to Brasidas resisted Athenian authority. The treaty, therefore, functioned less as a settlement than as a temporary suspension of hostilities between exhausted powers. Neither side had achieved decisive victory. Both had suffered the loss of visionary leadership, and neither could fully control its allies or the wider theater. The Battle of Amphipolis and the subsequent Peace of Nicias illustrate how the deaths of pivotal individuals can alter strategic trajectories and create opportunities for diplomacy, even amid unresolved conflict. Yet they also demonstrate the limits of negotiated peace when underlying grievances, economic pressures, and territorial ambitions remain unaddressed. The interlude provided by Nicias' truce would not resolve the tensions between Athens' imperial ambitions and Sparta's strategic imperatives, setting the stage for renewed and far more destructive warfare in the years to follow. The so-called Peace of Nicias, ratified in 421 BCE, quickly proved to be more a theoretical framework than a functional settlement. Both Athens and Sparta adhered to its provisions inconsistently, and several key allies actively undermined its implementation. Amphipolis, the strategically critical city in Thrace, refused to return to Athenian control, its population having tasted independence under Brasidas' leadership. Sparta, despite its formal commitment to the treaty, lacked the political cohesion to compel compliance, constrained by discontent among allies such as Corinth and Thebes. These states viewed the Spartan negotiation as a betrayal of their interests and began pursuing independent diplomatic initiatives. Meanwhile, Athens continued to enforce its imperial ambitions, exploiting the peace to consolidate influence and exact tribute wherever possible. This period also revealed the fragility of alliances and the enduring power of regional grievances. Argos, a historically neutral city-state with persistent hostility toward Sparta, used the instability to build an anti-Spartan coalition, drawing in Athens and smaller states seeking to challenge Peloponnesian dominance. The culmination of these tensions occurred in 418 BCE at the Battle of Mantinea, the largest land engagement of the conflict to that point. King Aegean II led approximately 9,000 Spartan and allied hoplites against a coalition that included 1,000 Athenian hoplites and forces from Argos and smaller polis. Despite numerical parity and coordination among the coalition, Spartan discipline and the cohesion of the hoplite phalanx proved decisive. Approximately 1,100 coalition troops were killed, compared with only 300 Spartan losses, decisively reasserting Sparta's supremacy in conventional land warfare. Mantinea demonstrated that, even without Brasidas, Spartan military organization remained unmatched on the battlefield, and that the Peloponnesian League's authority could be enforced through conventional force when necessary. While Sparta demonstrated strength on land, Athens pursued aggressive measures that undermined the peace's moral and practical foundations. In 416 BCE, the city targeted Melos, a small, neutral island of Dorian heritage that had refused to join the Delian League. Athens demanded submission, Melos resisted. Following a siege, Athenian forces executed all adult males, estimates range from 500 to 1,000, and enslaved women and children. Thucydides preserved this episode in the Melian dialogue, recording Athenian arguments that the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. The dialogue crystallizes the ethical tension inherent in imperial expansion, revealing how Athens justified extreme measures under the guise of strategic necessity. The massacre not only shocked contemporaries, but also signaled the city's willingness to enforce compliance through ruthlessness rather than negotiation, further straining relations with neutral and allied states. These 6 years after the Peace of Nicias illustrate the paradox of peace in the Peloponnesian context. Though major battles were infrequent compared to open war, the underlying conflicts, territorial, political, and economic, remained unresolved. Athens sought to consolidate power, demonstrate that defiance would result in punishment, and reinforce its maritime hegemony, while Sparta aimed to preserve the integrity of its league and resist the encroachment of Athenian influence. Neither side abandoned core objectives, and the resulting environment of intermittent warfare, diplomatic maneuvering, and strategic posturing made the peace inherently unstable. The events between 421 and 415 BCE demonstrate that treaties without enforcement mechanisms are often temporary pauses rather than genuine resolutions. The ongoing tensions and Athens' increasingly audacious policies foreshadowed a more ambitious and hazardous endeavor, the Sicilian expedition. This campaign would reflect Athens' growing confidence and hubris, promising territorial and economic expansion in the Western Mediterranean, while ultimately leading to catastrophic losses that reshaped the balance of power in Greece. In 415 BCE, the city of Segesta in western Sicily sent urgent appeals to Athens, requesting assistance against its neighboring rival Selinus, which was backed by Syracuse, the island's largest and most powerful Greek city. Segesta's ambassadors arrived with 60 talents of silver, reportedly a partial advance on funds available for a full-scale campaign, and promised that Athenian intervention would yield strategic and economic rewards far exceeding the investment. For Athens, still recovering from decades of intermittent warfare, the proposal presented both opportunity and peril. Success promised expansion into the Western Mediterranean and access to Sicily's wealth, while failure risked overextension and the depletion of vital resources. The Athenian assembly debated the plan intensely. Nicias, Now the senior statesman after Pericles and Cleon's deaths argued against the expedition. He cited Athens' lingering demographic losses from the plague, the strain on military manpower, and the considerable distance, approximately 800 miles, from Athenian logistical centers. Nicias emphasized that Athens had not yet consolidated its existing empire and warned that the campaign could transform a regional dispute into a protracted, catastrophic war. Opposing him was Alcibiades, a 30-something aristocrat whose ambition and charisma proved decisive. A nephew of Pericles and a former pupil of Socrates, Alcibiades combined political acumen with a compelling personal narrative. He leveraged his victories in the Olympic chariot races, luxurious lifestyle, and persuasive oratory to build widespread popular support. Alcibiades framed the expedition not merely as support for Segesta, but as an opportunity to subdue Syracuse, incorporate its resources into the Athenian Empire, and establish Athenian dominance over Sicily. In his vision, the conquest of Syracuse could extend Athens' influence into Carthage and even Italy, creating a Mediterranean superpower unmatched in history. The Athenian assembly, captivated by Alcibiades' rhetoric and the prospect of imperial glory, approved an expedition far larger than requested by Segesta. The armada would consist of 134 triremes carrying 5,100 hoplites and approximately 30,000 personnel in total, representing nearly half of Athens' effective military capacity. Strategic objectives, however, remained vague. Was the mission a defensive operation for Segesta, an outright conquest of Syracuse, or an ambitious campaign to subjugate all of Sicily? This ambiguity was compounded by the appointment of three generals with divergent priorities. Alcibiades wielded political influence and ambitious designs. Nicias embodied caution and senior authority, and Lamachus contributed practical military expertise but limited political weight. Divided command ensured that strategic cohesion would be difficult from the outset. Compounding the expedition's precarious departure, a shocking religious scandal struck Athens in the weeks before sailing. Vandals mutilated a large number of Hermae, sacred stone statues of Hermes scattered throughout the city, an act interpreted as sacrilege. Alcibiades' political opponents accused him of complicity, framing the incident as part of an oligarchic conspiracy. Though investigations continued, the accusations generated widespread suspicion and anxiety, casting a shadow over the fleet's launch. Despite uncertainty, the fleet departed in June 415 BCE, carrying a democracy's highest hopes for expansion and wealth. Yet the combination of overextended objectives, divided command, and political tension created conditions ripe for miscalculation. Athens committed a substantial portion of its military power to a theater it poorly understood, influenced as much by ambition and charisma as by strategic necessity. The Sicilian expedition thus began under the dual pressures of opportunity and mismanagement, foreshadowing the catastrophic unraveling that would follow and marking one of the most consequential episodes in Athenian imperial history. The Athenian-Sicilian expedition, launched in 415 BCE with extraordinary ambition, encountered disaster almost from the outset. Upon arrival in western Sicily during the summer, the fleet and army discovered that Segesta's purported wealth was largely fictitious. The city had displayed borrowed gold and silver plates at multiple banquets to create an impression of abundance, leaving the Athenians with only 30 talents instead of the promised fortune. This revelation should have prompted reconsideration or withdrawal, but ambition and pride, most notably that of Alcibiades, prevented any immediate retreat. The expedition had already committed enormous manpower and resources, and Athenian leaders were unwilling to concede that the campaign had begun under false pretenses. Before operations commenced, political developments further destabilized command. Alcibiades was recalled to Athens to face trial for the mutilation of the Hermae and additional charges for mocking the Eleusinian mysteries. Recognizing the near certainty of conviction, he fled to Sparta, where he offered strategic advice to Athens' adversaries. Alcibiades revealed Athenian plans, encouraged Sparta to intervene directly in Sicily, and recommended fortifying Decilia and Attica year-round. a proposal that would later transform the war from seasonal raids to permanent occupation. With Alcibiades gone, command devolved to Nicias, a cautious and indecisive statesman, and Lamachus, a competent but politically weaker general. The Athenians initially made some progress. In autumn 415 BCE, they began a siege of Syracuse, employing rapid wall building to attempt a complete investment of the city. Yet Nicias' characteristic indecision allowed Syracuse to complete counter-walls, negating Athens' initial advantage. By 414 BCE, Spartan reinforcements under the experienced General Gylippus arrived, invigorating Syracusan forces and reversing the strategic situation. Lamachus died in combat, leaving the ill and hesitant Nicias in sole command. Recognizing the growing threat, Athens sent reinforcements under Demosthenes in 413 BCE, bringing 73 ships and 5,000 hoplites. Attempts to regain initiative included a night assault on the Epipoli Plateau, but darkness, confusion, and Syracusan preparedness resulted in a catastrophic defeat, with approximately 2,000 Athenian casualties. Demosthenes urged immediate evacuation, but Nicias, paralyzed by indecision and superstition, delayed. The situation worsened during a lunar eclipse in August 413 BCE. Nicias, relying on seers' advice, postponed withdrawal for 27 days. This delay proved fatal. Syracuse blockaded the Athenian fleet within the Great Harbor using booms and chains, neutralizing Athens' naval superiority. In subsequent naval engagements, confined waters prevented effective maneuvering, and the Syracusans destroyed much of the Athenian fleet. By September 413 BCE, a retreat overland began. Approximately 40,000 Athenians and allies attempted a fighting withdrawal, constantly harassed by Syracusan cavalry and light infantry. Exhaustion, thirst, and relentless attacks caused massive casualties. Survivors surrendered at the Asinaris River, including Nicias and Demosthenes, who were executed. Roughly 7,000 prisoners were confined in the stone quarries, or latomiae, where most perished from starvation, disease, and exposure over months. Of the massive expeditionary force, fewer than 1,000 returned to Athens. The Sicilian disaster exemplifies how strategic overreach, indecisive leadership, and tactical misjudgment can cascade into catastrophe. Athens' greatest military undertaking became its most devastating defeat, erasing a generation of soldiers and undermining confidence in both leadership and military competence. Beyond the immediate loss of men and material, the psychological and political shock reverberated across the Aegean world, weakening Athens' empire and emboldening Sparta. The failure in Sicily decisively shifted momentum, paving the way for a new phase of conflict in which Sparta, now able to act aggressively in Attica, would challenge Athenian supremacy more effectively, inaugurating the destructive Decelean War that brought Athens to the brink of total collapse. The aftermath of the Sicilian expedition irrevocably altered Athens' strategic, political, and psychological landscape. The immediate military losses were staggering. Approximately 200 ships destroyed and between 40,000 and 50,000 men killed or captured. In the context of Athens' earlier demographic devastation from the plague, these losses were irreplaceable. Financially, the expedition exhausted over 2,000 talents, representing more than 3 years of tribute revenue from the Delian League. Beyond material depletion, Athens' naval supremacy, the foundation of its empire, was suddenly exposed as vulnerable, undermining the perception of invincibility that had sustained Athenian power for decades. The psychological and political consequences were immediate and profound. Subject allies across the Aegean, long restrained by fear of Athens' naval and military dominance, recognized opportunity. Revolts erupted in critical territories. Chios, with 60 ships, Miletus, controlling access to Asia Minor, Lesbos, and several smaller allies abandoned the empire, triggering a cascading effect that threatened imperial collapse. Athens' failure emboldened Sparta, which moved decisively to capitalize on the weakened state. Drawing on advice previously provided by Alcibiades, the Spartans fortified Decelia in the spring of 413 BCE, establishing a permanent garrison just 14 miles from Athens. This development transformed the war from seasonal incursions into permanent occupation, rendering Attica's agricultural lands unusable and creating a constant threat to urban and rural populations alike. Simultaneously, an estimated 20,000 slaves, essential to Athens' silver mines at Laurium, defected to Decelia, collapsing the city's mining revenues and undermining fiscal stability. Athens now relied almost entirely on imported grain and increasingly reluctant tribute from rebellious allies to sustain its population and military. Internally, the disaster exposed vulnerabilities within Athens' democratic system. Political elites, blaming democratic decision-making for the Sicilian catastrophe, orchestrated a coup in 411 BCE, temporarily replacing the assembly with the oligarchic council of 400. Although democracy was restored within months, the episode revealed deep fractures in Athenian society and foreshadowed recurring internal instability. Citizens confronted both the tangible consequences of strategic miscalculation and the moral crisis of lost lives, creating fertile ground for factionalism, disillusionment, and elite opportunism. Externally, Athens' weakened position invited renewed intervention by Persia. Persian satraps in Asia Minor, perceiving an unprecedented opportunity, negotiated with Sparta, providing financial subsidies to construct a fleet capable of challenging Athens at sea. In return, Greek cities in Asia Minor reverted to Persian influence. This arrangement fundamentally altered strategic dynamics, introducing Persian resources as a force multiplier for Sparta and undermining the Athenian Empire's traditional control over its maritime dependencies. The Sicilian disaster marked a decisive turning point in the Peloponnesian War. Athens transitioned from a position of dominant aggressor to desperate defender, simultaneously confronting rebellion, occupation, and foreign intervention. Sparta, emboldened by its new strategic advantages and Persian support, now possessed both the confidence and means to challenge Athens on multiple fronts. The interplay of military defeat, financial collapse, political upheaval, and renewed external pressure illustrates how systemic crises emerge from a single catastrophic failure. Athens' empire, once expansive and seemingly secure, now faced existential threats that compounded with alarming rapidity, demonstrating that wars are often lost not solely through battlefield defeat, but through the cascading consequences of strategic, economic, and political vulnerabilities. The cumulative effects of these crises forced Athens into a defensive struggle that would define the war's final phase. With resources depleted, internal cohesion fractured, and external threats proliferating, the city confronted the ultimate question: could it survive, or was systemic collapse inevitable? This precarious balance between survival and annihilation framed the next stage of the conflict, as Athens struggled to resist a fully coordinated, multi-pronged assault by Sparta, its rebellious allies, and Persian financiers. Following the Sicilian catastrophe, Sparta abandoned long-standing ideological reservations in pursuit of strategic advantage. Historically xenophobic and deeply skeptical of foreign entanglements, the Spartans recognized that Athens' maritime supremacy could not be challenged without external support. In 412 BCE, Sparta negotiated treaties with Persian satraps Tissaphernes, governing Lydia and Coria, and Pharnabazus, overseeing Hellespontine Phrygia. The agreements stipulated that Greek cities in Asia Minor, liberated from Persia by Athens in the decades after the Persian Wars, would revert to Persian control. In return, Persia would provide financial subsidies enabling Sparta to construct and maintain a fleet capable of challenging Athenian dominance. This arrangement marked a radical departure from 70 years of Greek policy, defending city-state autonomy, and betrayed the rhetoric of Greek freedom that Sparta had long championed. Strategic necessity, however, outweighed ideology. Persian contributions, estimated at 30 to 50 talents annually, allowed Sparta to build, arm, and crew a fleet eventually numbering over 200 triremes. This development fundamentally altered the war's strategic landscape. Athens, which had previously relied on unchallenged naval supremacy to enforce empire and secure grain shipments from the Black Sea, now faced a competent maritime rival. Naval engagements became contested affairs rather than predictable demonstrations of Athenian skill. At Cynossema in 411 BCE, near the Hellespont, Athens achieved a tactical victory through superior maneuvering, demonstrating that traditional Athenian trireme tactics still held merit. Yet the Spartan fleet remained operational, avoiding destruction and proving that Athenian dominance could be challenged. Later that year, at Abydos, Athens again won narrowly, but the engagements failed to eliminate Spartan naval capacity, signaling that the war's decisive center had shifted. The Hellespont, a narrow strait linking the Aegean to the Black Sea, emerged as the new strategic focal point. Grain shipments critical to Athens' sustenance passed through this choke point. Both Athens and Sparta recognized that control of these waterways equated to control over the city's survival. Athens deployed substantial naval forces to protect convoys and secure key Hellespontine cities such as Byzantium and Cestus. Simultaneously, Sparta sought to strangle Athens economically by establishing blockades and harassing supply lines. Engagements increasingly resembled a strategic chess match rather than conventional battles. Control, endurance, and logistics became as decisive as combat proficiency. The financial demands of sustained naval warfare placed immense strain on both states. Athens, already weakened by the Sicilian disaster, loss of Laurium's silver, and widespread ally revolts, resorted to extraordinary measures, including melting down gold statues of Nike from the Acropolis to mint emergency coinage. Sparta, though reliant on Persian subsidies, faced delays and underpayments from Tissaphernes, whose shifting policy aimed to maintain balance between Greek powers rather than secure Spartan victory outright. This dynamic forced Sparta to stretch its resources, integrating newly trained crews and inexperienced sailors into a traditionally land-focused military culture. The emergence of a Spartan fleet capable of contesting Athenian control represented a profound strategic and ideological transformation. Land-based hoplite warriors had been the backbone of Sparta's power for centuries. Developing naval expertise required not only resources, but a recalibration of military identity. By embracing maritime warfare, Sparta signaled that strategic necessity could override cultural tradition, even at the cost of ideological compromise with Persia. The intensification of naval conflict coincided with internal crises in Athens. Political instability, including the oligarchic coup of 411 BCE, threatened democratic governance, just as external pressure mounted. Athens now faced simultaneous challenges, defending its empire against a Persian-backed Spartan fleet, securing critical supply lines through the Hellespont, and preserving internal political cohesion. The combination of these external and internal pressures created the most precarious phase in Athenian history, illustrating how naval supremacy, geographic choke points, and fiscal resources could determine the survival of a state. As the Aegean became a theater of high-stakes maritime warfare, the consequences of Spartan-Persian cooperation set the stage for the war's final, decisive phase, a struggle in which Athens' resilience, leadership, and capacity for adaptation would be tested against coordinated external enemies and persistent internal instability. The Sicilian disaster had far-reaching consequences beyond military defeat, directly triggering Athens' first successful coup against its democratic institutions. By 411 BCE, widespread disillusionment with the assembly and political leadership created fertile ground for oligarchic conspirators. Wealthy aristocrats, blaming democratic mismanagement for Athens' catastrophic losses, and persuaded that Persia would provide financial support if the city abandoned radical democracy, orchestrated a coup. These conspirators operated through secretive hetairai, political clubs that facilitated planning, assassination of key democratic leaders, and intimidation of supporters. In May 411 BCE, the conspirators dissolved the Council of 500 and established the Council of 400, restricting political participation to approximately 5,000 wealthy citizens from the previous 30,000. Mechanisms that enabled lower-class citizens to participate, payment for jury service and assembly attendance, were eliminated, consolidating power within a narrow oligarchic elite. The coup initially succeeded due to the military crisis and the absence of Athens' primary fighting force. the fleet stationed at Samos protecting Ionian allies. Sailors and lower-class hoplites serving abroad, informed of events in the city, refused to recognize the 400 as legitimate. They declared themselves the true representatives of Athens and recalled Alcibiades from exile to command them, despite his prior treachery. The fleet's loyalty proved decisive. Its operational capacity allowed Athens to maintain strategic initiative, winning significant naval engagements at Cynossema and Abydos, while the 400 in Athens fractured into competing factions. Radical oligarchs, unable to consolidate authority without military support, faced inevitable compromise. In September 411 BCE, the 400 dissolved and were replaced by a government of the 5,000, a moderate oligarchy maintaining property qualifications but permitting broader political participation. This intermediate regime, though oligarchic in structure, temporarily stabilized Athens' internal governance while preserving partial citizen engagement. The full restoration of democracy came in the summer of 410 BCE, following a decisive naval victory at Cyzicus, where Athens destroyed a Spartan fleet of approximately 60 ships. Alcibiades, despite his prior betrayals, received credit for orchestrating the resurgence and was recalled to supreme command. Yet his reputation remained controversial, reflecting the enduring tension between individual ambition and collective governance. The oligarchic episode underscored both the vulnerabilities and resilience of Athenian democracy. The city's institutions nearly collapsed not because of direct military defeat, but due to elite manipulation amid crisis. Democracy survived because the common sailors, empowered with military capability and motivated by loyalty to civic ideals, refused to accept oligarchic authority. Their actions demonstrated that political legitimacy rested not solely on formal institutions or elite consent, but on the broader participation and enforcement power of ordinary citizens. Military and political authority were thus intertwined. The same fleet that projected Athenian power abroad simultaneously safeguarded democratic governance at home. This episode offers a profound insight into the structural foundations of democracy under extreme stress. Economic hardship, military failure, and elite discontent can converge to threaten established governance. Yet resilience depends on the engagement and agency of the wider populace. For Athens, the loyalty of the fleet created a paradoxical situation in which instruments of empire, triremes, sailors, and hoplites, became instruments of democratic preservation rather than coercion. The survival of Athens' political system, despite internal coup and external disaster, illustrates the complex interplay between military power, social cohesion, and institutional legitimacy. The fleet's steadfast commitment to democratic principles enabled Athens to continue prosecuting the war even after the Sicilian debacle and internal political crisis. This temporary resurgence under Alcibiades' command offered a fleeting demonstration that Athens might recover, setting the stage for the final, climactic phase of resistance against both Spartan aggression and internal fragmentation. Between 411 and 408 BCE, Athens experienced an extraordinary, if temporary, revival under the command of Alcibiades, whose recall by the fleet at Samos allowed the city to regain operational initiative despite the catastrophic aftermath of Sicily. His leadership combined strategic daring, political acumen, and personal charisma, enabling Athens to secure victories that temporarily restored naval dominance and reasserted control over critical supply lines. The apex of this resurgence occurred at the Battle of Cyzicus in April 410 BCE, a confrontation that demonstrated both Alcibiades' tactical genius and the strategic importance of controlling maritime choke points. Cyzicus, located on the Propontis, commanded access between the Aegean and Black Sea, the vital corridor through which Athens imported grain essential for feeding its population. The Peloponnesian fleet, approximately 60 ships under Spartan Admiral Mindarus, threatened this lifeline. Alcibiades, commanding 86 triremes, employed a sophisticated ruse. He feigned retreat with a small squadron, luring Mindarus into a pursuit that drew the Peloponnesians into a vulnerable position. Concealed behind a headland, Alcibiades' main force then attacked, while Athenian land forces simultaneously assaulted Cyzicus itself. The Peloponnesian fleet, trapped between converging naval and land contingents, suffered near total destruction. All 60 ships were captured or sunk. Mindarus was killed in action, and surviving crew attempting to flee ashore were hunted down. A Spartan dispatch conveyed the magnitude of the disaster. Ships lost. Mindarus dead. Men starving. Know not what to do. The victory restored Athens' control over the Hellespont, securing the grain route from the Black Sea and momentarily reversing the strategic advantage gained by Sparta after Sicily. Following Cyzicus, Alcibiades conducted campaigns along the Propontis and Bosporus between 410 and 408 BCE, recapturing revolted cities and restoring Athenian influence in Asia Minor. In 408 BCE, he seized Byzantium through a combination of siegecraft and political manipulation, securing control over the Bosporus, another crucial grain corridor. These successes reinforced the perception that Athens could still recover from its earlier disasters, and in 407 BCE, Alcibiades returned to the city itself after 8 years in exile. He received a triumphant welcome. The assembly officially rescinded his banishment, restored his property, and granted him supreme command, strategos autocrator, over all Athenian forces, an unprecedented concentration of military authority. Despite this temporary resurgence, the underlying vulnerabilities of Athens remained unresolved. The city faced financial exhaustion, a depleted population following the plague and Sicilian losses, and the looming reality of a Persian-funded Spartan navy capable of contesting maritime supremacy. Alcibiades' authority rested entirely on continued military success, creating a fragile political foundation. Any major defeat would immediately erode confidence and unravel his coalition. His tactical brilliance could achieve operational victories, as at Cyzicus, but could not fundamentally alter Athens' strategic overextension or compensate for systemic economic and demographic limitations. In essence, Alcibiades' resurgence postponed, rather than prevented, the inevitable decline of Athens' power. This episode illustrates the double-edged nature of charismatic leadership in democratic societies under crisis. Extraordinary individual talent can temporarily reverse a state's decline, boost morale, and recover critical territories. Yet such revivals often create illusions of sustainability that mask the structural weaknesses demanding long-term strategic correction. Alcibiades' triumphs provided Athens with a fleeting sense of invincibility, yet they also concealed the financial depletion, internal instability, and strategic overreach that would render the city vulnerable to the final, decisive phase of the Peloponnesian War. His eventual fall and Athens' subsequent naval catastrophes would reveal that tactical brilliance could not substitute for systemic resilience, setting the stage for the concluding campaigns that would determine the city's fate. Alcibiades' spectacular career ended abruptly, a victim of both circumstance and the volatile politics of Athens. In 406 BCE, while engaged in diplomatic negotiations away from his fleet, his subordinate Antiochus disobeyed explicit orders and initiated an engagement with a Peloponnesian squadron near Notium. The result was a tactical disaster. Athens lost approximately 22 ships. Although Alcibiades quickly returned to restore discipline and prevent further losses, the political repercussions were irreversible. His numerous enemies in the Athenian assembly, democratic politicians who resented his arrogance and oligarchs who distrusted his shifting loyalties, seized upon the Notium debacle to strip him of command in the summer of 406 BC. Facing potential prosecution and political humiliation, Alcibiades retreated to his private fortifications in the Thracian Chersonese, effectively self-exiling for the remainder of the war. He would die in 404 BCE, assassinated in Phrygia, possibly at the behest of Spartan or Persian interests. Athens had lost its most capable, if unpredictable, commander at the very moment his leadership was most needed. Meanwhile, Sparta capitalized on Athens' loss of command. In 407 BCE, Lysander, a Mothax, a non-spartiate raised in the rigorous Aegean system, was appointed navarch, an admiral empowered to lead the Spartan fleet. Lysander was no ordinary Spartan officer. Politically astute, comfortable with diplomacy, and personally connected to Persian Prince Cyrus the Younger, he leveraged these relationships to secure substantial financial and logistical support. Cyrus, sent by King Darius II to oversee Western satraps, provided generous funding, increasing daily pay for rowers from 3 to 4 obols, which attracted experienced crews, including defectors from Athenian service. Using these resources, Lysander expanded the Spartan fleet to over 200 triremes, creating a naval force capable of contesting Athens' dominance for the first time in decades. Lysander's approach integrated military strategy with long-term political planning. Beyond winning battles, he cultivated oligarchic factions in Ionian cities, establishing loyal client regimes that could outlast immediate military campaigns. His strategy combined the coercive power of a well-funded fleet with diplomacy, economic manipulation, and political engineering, a comprehensive vision to replace the Athenian Empire with a Spartan-controlled Hellenic order enforced through local oligarchies. This holistic approach went beyond traditional Spartan land-based military thinking, making Lysander arguably the most consequential individual of the war's final phase. He demonstrated that talent and strategic insight could overcome rigid social hierarchies, reshaping Greek political structures in ways even the Spartan kings found threatening. The removal of Alcibiades and the rise of Lysander set the stage for the war's decisive conclusion. With Athens deprived of its most innovative commander and Sparta now possessing a well-funded, strategically minded naval leader, the balance of power shifted irreversibly. The next engagements, the naval battles of Arginusi and ultimately Aegospotami, would determine the fate of Athens, illustrating how leadership transitions and individual capability could shape the outcome of an entire conflict. In August 406 BCE, Athens confronted one of the last opportunities to assert its naval resilience against Sparta's increasingly dominant fleet. The Peloponnesians, under the command of Callicratidas, Lysander's temporary successor, as Spartan law prohibited consecutive navarch terms, had blockaded the Athenian fleet in the harbor of Mytilene on Lesbos. Athens' remaining naval force numbered approximately 70 ships, a small fraction of its former dominance, and the blockade threatened the complete loss of the city's seaborne power. Recognizing the existential danger, Athens responded with extraordinary measures. The state melted down gold votive dedications from the Acropolis to fund warships, promised freedom to slaves who rowed in the fleet, and conscripted medics, resident foreigners, and impoverished citizens typically exempt from military service. Within 30 days, Athens assembled a formidable fleet of 150 ships, nearly doubling its trapped force and demonstrating the city's remarkable capacity for mobilization even under extreme duress. In late August, this hastily prepared fleet engaged Callicratidas' 120 ships near the Arginusi Islands off the coast of Asia Minor. Employing superior seamanship and a disciplined double-line formation designed to prevent the Peloponnesians from executing their signature Deiplos maneuver, the Athenians achieved a decisive tactical victory. Approximately 70 Spartan ships, including Callicratidas' flagship, were sunk or captured, the admiral himself drowned, and Athens lost only 25 vessels. The blockade of Mytilene was broken, providing a temporary reprieve for the city's naval and strategic position. However, the victory's aftermath quickly became a catastrophe of a different kind. A sudden storm swept the battlefield, preventing rescue of survivors from damaged Athenian ships and the recovery of the dead, a task considered sacred in Greek religion. Roughly 1,000 Athenian sailors drowned when their vessels foundered, and the inability to perform proper burial rites incited outrage among families and the public. Back in Athens, this emotional turmoil escalated into political disaster. The 8 generals who commanded at Arginusi faced prosecution for failing to rescue survivors and retrieve the bodies. The trial became a combustible mix of grief, anger, and demagoguery. Subordinate triarchs, assigned to conduct rescues, were blamed, families demanded justice, and political agitators exploited the situation for personal gain. In a flagrant violation of law, the assembly voted to try all 8 generals collectively rather than individually, a procedure explicitly prohibited in Athenian jurisprudence. Socrates, then serving as one of the Prytaneus, alone refused to allow this illegal action, but the assembly overruled him. 6 generals present in Athens were convicted and executed in autumn 406 BCE. 2 had prudently fled. The city had, in essence, eliminated its most experienced naval commanders immediately before facing Sparta in the war's final, decisive campaigns. The Arginusi trial remains a stark illustration of democracy's vulnerability to emotion-driven decision-making. Athens executed the very men who had delivered its last great victory, prioritizing short-term vengeance over long-term strategic interests. Public grief, fear, and political demagoguery overwhelmed legal norms, leaving the fleet under inexperienced officers at the precise moment when Lysander, now effectively commanding Sparta's navy once more, circumventing term limits through the technicality of serving as vice-admiral, would confront the Athenians in the climactic battle of the Peloponnesian War. The city's self-inflicted removal of competent leadership would prove catastrophic, setting the stage for the final destruction of Athenian naval power. By the summer of 405 BCE, Athens teetered on the brink of existential collapse. Its lifeline, grain shipments from the Black Sea, passed through the narrow Hellespont, a choke point now dominated by Sparta's most capable commander, Lysander. With a fleet of roughly 170 ships positioned at Lampsacus on the Aegean shore, he effectively threatened the city's very survival. Athens responded by dispatching its remaining 180 triremes under multiple commanders. No single general possessed sufficient experience, political authority, or charisma to unify command. The fleet anchored at Aegospotami, a stretch of open beach on the European shore directly opposite Lampsacus. The site offered no harbor, no nearby town, and minimal defensive infrastructure, forcing sailors to disperse daily to forage for food, a vulnerability Lysander would exploit with precision. For 4 consecutive days, the Athenians maintained the same pattern. They rowed across the strait, drew up in battle formation, and challenged Lysander to engage. Each day, Lysander refused to fight, retreating just far enough to avoid confrontation. Each afternoon, the Athenian crews returned to Aegospotami and scattered along the shore to gather supplies. Alcibiades, observing from his nearby fortress, recognized the peril. He rode to the Athenian camp, warning that Aegospotami was dangerously exposed and recommending relocation to Cestus, a fortified city with a proper harbor. The generals, suspicious of Alcibiades' motives and resentful of counsel from a long-exiled traitor, dismissed his advice. On the 5th day, August 405 BCE, the pattern repeated. Athens' fleet rowed out, formed, and challenged Lysander, only to return and disperse in the afternoon. Lysander, having studied the enemy's routine for days, struck with flawless timing. He launched his full fleet across the strait in less than 30 minutes, achieving total surprise. Most Athenian ships were either empty or crewed only by skeleton detachments. The vessels that did attempt to fight operated independently, lacking coordination or central command. What should have been a naval engagement became a massacre. Lysander captured approximately 170 Athenian ships intact, lining them up on the beach alongside his own, a chilling visual of annihilation. Only the Athenian general Conon escaped with 9 ships, fleeing to Cyprus to deliver news of the catastrophe rather than face the city directly. Lysander's treatment of prisoners was brutal. Roughly 3,000 to 4,000 Athenian captives were executed, a calculated act of revenge for prior Athenian atrocities, most notably at Melos, and a ruthless effort to eliminate Athens' naval manpower permanently. The destruction was absolute. Athens now had no ships, no way to defend its grain convoys, and no means to maintain imperial control. Within weeks, Lysander capitalized on his victory. He sailed through the Aegean, installing oligarchic governments and former Athenian allies, collecting additional ships, and consolidating a Spartan-dominated fleet that would soon exceed 200 vessels. Athens' strategic position was irreversibly compromised. The loss at Aegospotami demonstrated how routine procedural negligence, poor command, and failure to anticipate enemy strategy could erase centuries of naval dominance in a single, swift stroke. For Athens, it was not merely a defeat. It was the terminal collapse of its ability to resist, a turning point that guaranteed the city's eventual surrender. Aegospotami left Athens defenseless, paving the way for Sparta's final siege, a campaign not of pitched battles, but of blockade, starvation, and the imposition of unconditional surrender. The stage was set for the fall of the Athenian Empire, the end of its democracy, and the dramatic conclusion to nearly 3 decades of relentless conflict. News of the catastrophe at Aegospotami reached Athens under cover of night aboard the state galley Perilous. Thucydides records the moment with haunting brevity. The Perilous arrived at Athens by night with news of the disaster, and a sound of wailing ran from Piraeus through the long walls to the city, one man passing the news to another. That night, no one slept. Athenians instantly understood the scale of their defeat. With Lysander's fleet controlling the sea, the city's grain lifeline was severed. Athens could neither import food nor expect relief. Surrender or starvation were the only conceivable options. Yet, despite the inevitability of disaster, the city chose to resist, whether from desperation, pride, or the faint hope that Sparta's allies might temper total destruction. In autumn 405 BCE, Lysander's strategy was methodical and unyielding. Over 150 ships blockaded Piraeus, while Spartan king Pausanias led the Peloponnesian army to encircle Athens by land. The long walls, which had once guaranteed safe access between the city and its port during the Aegean War, now trapped the population inside, with dwindling food supplies compounding the danger. The siege unfolded slowly and inexorably over approximately 8 months, from September 405 to April 404 BCE. No grand assaults occurred. Sparta's strength lay in patience and attrition. Within the walls, conditions deteriorated steadily. Food shortages became critical, rationing failed, and starvation claimed an increasing toll among citizens. By spring 404 BCE, Athens faced societal collapse. The assembly dispatched embassies to negotiate terms of surrender. Sparta's allies, particularly Corinth and Thebes, advocated for total annihilation, razing the city, enslaving its population, and erasing Athens from the map entirely, a standard response in Greek warfare for defeated enemies who had resisted fiercely. Yet Spartan leaders, including King Pausanias, overruled these demands. Destroying Athens outright would destabilize the Greek balance of power, potentially empowering rival cities like Thebes or Corinth. Furthermore, memory of Athens' decisive contribution against Persia at Salamis in 480 BC carried moral and political weight, shaping Spartan moderation. Negotiations concluded in April 404 BCE with terms that effectively ended Athenian independence while preserving its population. Athens agreed to dismantle the long walls and Piraeus fortifications, surrender all but 12 ships, retained only for coastal policing, recall exiles, join the Peloponnesian League, and accept Spartan oversight of foreign policy. Enforced on April 25, 404 BCE, the surrender proceeded with chilling ceremony. Peloponnesian soldiers oversaw the demolition of the long walls, accompanied by flute girls playing music, while Lysander's fleet entered Piraeus unopposed. Sparta's allies reportedly celebrated the day as the beginning of freedom for Greece, though the freedom they anticipated would prove largely illusory. The siege demonstrates that military victory alone does not dictate political settlement. Sparta's decision to preserve Athens, rather than destroy it, reflected calculated strategy, respect for historical precedent, and awareness of regional balance. It was an act of restraint, not mercy, a deliberate choice to end the war decisively while maintaining the broader Greek order. Athens, meanwhile, transitioned from a dominant empire to a city under foreign supervision, its democracy disrupted and its independence curtailed, setting the stage for internal political experimentation and the rise of the 30 tyrants. The surrender marked the conclusion of the Peloponnesian War militarily, but initiated a new chapter of political struggle, as Sparta sought to reshape Athens from without, imposing oligarchic authority that would reveal the limits of victory, without sustainable governance. Following Athens' surrender in 404 BCE, Lysander enforced a central term of Spartan policy, the establishment of a pro-Spartan government. That summer, 30 Athenians, selected from known oligarchic sympathizers, including Critias, a relative of Plato and former associate of Socrates, assumed absolute authority, claiming the mandate to restore the ancestral constitution. Known as the 30 Tyrants, this regime immediately imposed a reign of terror. Citing the need to purge sycophants and democratic agitators, they executed roughly 1,500 citizens without trial within months, confiscating property to enrich themselves and sustain the Spartan garrison stationed on the Acropolis. Medics suffered particularly harshly, with at least 100 killed solely to seize their wealth. Political participation was drastically curtailed, with citizenship restricted to 3,000 aristocrats, disenfranchising the majority. Critias ruled with a rigid philosophical ideology, asserting that democracy was mob rule and only educated elites should govern, a stance that would later shape the charges brought against Socrates. The 30s' brutality provoked widespread resentment. Democratic exiles, led by Thrasybulus, regrouped at Thebes, which refused Spartan demands to return them. In winter 404 to 403 BCE, Thrasybulus led 70 exiles to seize the fortress of Philae in the Attic Mountains. The 30s' forces failed to dislodge them, emboldening democratic forces. In spring 403 BCE, Thrasybulus advanced on Piraeus with roughly 1,000 supporters, fortifying Munichia Hill. When the 30 attempted to suppress them, the Democrats repulsed the attack, killing Critias in the process. This decisive defeat fractured oligarchic cohesion. Moderates within the 3,000 negotiated with democratic forces, while hardliners retreated to Eleusis. Sparta, observing the instability, intervened cautiously. Unlike Lysander, who had zealously supported the 30, King Pausanias prioritized reconciliation. He negotiated a settlement. The 30 were dissolved, democracy was restored under traditional laws, and amnesty was granted for past political crimes, with the exception of the 30 themselves. By September 403 BCE, Athens formally reinstated democratic governance. Remarkably, the amnesty held, limiting revenge killings and allowing the city to recover politically without widespread retribution. The remaining oligarchic resistance at Eleusis was finally neutralized in 401 BCE, ending organized opposition to democracy. The episode illustrates the limits of externally imposed political systems. Sparta's attempt to engineer oligarchic rule in a fiercely democratic city ultimately failed because it ignored local political culture and underestimated popular resolve. Despite total military defeat and foreign occupation, Athens' democratic identity remained potent, sustained by committed citizens willing to resist authoritarian imposition. The 30 tyrants' collapse demonstrated that military victory alone does not guarantee political control. Legitimacy derives from both coercion and local acceptance, and the latter cannot be manufactured by foreign power. Athens' restoration of democracy marked the conclusion of its 27-year struggle, setting the stage for reflection on the war's long-term consequences. The transformation of Greek interstate relations, military innovation, political theory, and intellectual life. The resilience of democratic governance amidst extreme adversity offers a striking case study in the limits of occupation and the enduring strength of civic culture. The Peloponnesian War left an indelible mark on the Greek world, and nowhere was the devastation more acute than in Athens. Before hostilities began, Athens boasted approximately 40,000 to 45,000 adult male citizens, a population that formed the backbone of its democracy, military, and economic systems. The onset of the war coincided with the catastrophic plague of 430 to 426 BCE, which claimed perhaps 75,000 to 100,000 lives, including citizens, medics, and slaves. This amounted to roughly one-third of Athens' population, sparking social dislocation, panic, and collapse of civic norms. Beyond the plague, military campaigns exacted further tolls. The Sicilian expedition alone, 415 to 413 BC, cost Athens approximately 50,000 citizens and allied troops, a figure amplified by casualties sustained during yearly campaigns, naval battles, and protracted sieges throughout the 27-year war. By 404 BCE, the number of adult male citizens had likely fallen to roughly 20,000, a demographic collapse of roughly 50%, unprecedented in Greek history. Sparta experienced analogous proportional losses among its elite Spartiates, whose rigid social system prevented rapid population recovery. By the time of the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, Sparta could field only 700 Spartiates, down from approximately 8,000 in 480 BC, a decline directly traceable to Peloponnesian War attrition combined with the polis's stringent citizenship requirements. Material devastation accompanied demographic collapse. Athens' silver mines at Laurium, a critical source of state revenue, were destroyed or depopulated during the Decelean War and never regained pre-war productivity. Agricultural infrastructure fared no better. Repeated invasions, scorched earth campaigns, and sieges systematically destroyed olive groves, vineyards, and arable land. The recovery of olive trees alone required 15 years for maturation, ensuring that economic stabilization would be a multi-generational struggle. Total economic losses for Athens exceeded 10,000 talents, roughly equivalent to 2 to 3 billion in modern purchasing power. The city also suffered immense structural damage, fortifications demolished, dockyards burned, and a fleet of roughly 400 to 500 triremes lost over the course of the war, each valued at 1 talent. Outside Athens, smaller polis across Sicily, Ionia, and Thrace experienced siege, sack, and depopulation. Many disappeared entirely, absorbed by neighbors, or left irretrievably empty. The war thus marked the end of the demographic expansion characteristic of the Archaic period, transforming the Greek world from a dynamic, growing civilization into one profoundly weakened and demographically stagnant. The consequences of this demographic and material catastrophe were not merely quantitative. Losing half its population in a single generation fundamentally altered Athens' social and political fabric. Civic institutions reliant on robust citizen participation, democratic assemblies, juries, militias, were strained to the breaking point. Labor shortages undermined economic production, while grief and trauma permeated every layer of society. Politically, the losses fueled cynicism, factionalism, and social unrest, rendering democratic governance precarious and fostering oligarchic opportunism, as seen during the coups of 411 and 404 BCE. Beyond Athens, the Greek world experienced heightened fragility. City-states previously capable of regional dominance now confronted internal weakness, demographic depletion, and diminished capacity for interstate cooperation. The war's demographic catastrophe invites reflection. When a civilization loses half its population, can it ever fully recover its former vigor? In Athens' case, the answer is complex. While the city-state would later regain some prosperity, the demographic, economic, and psychological scars permanently altered its historical trajectory. The Peloponnesian War demonstrated that the costs of total war extend far beyond military defeat, reshaping population structures, economies, and political cultures in ways that resonate across generations. The next consequence of this demographic collapse was a profound transformation in Greek political consciousness, eroding faith in the polis, legal norms, and interstate trust, and setting the stage for 4th-century Greek politics characterized by instability, factionalism, and realpolitik diplomacy. The Peloponnesian War fundamentally reshaped Greek political life, revealing the fragility of the polis system and undermining assumptions that had guided interstate relations and internal governance for centuries. Before 431 BCE, the ideal of the polis encompassed a self-sufficient political community bound by law, nomos, shared civic values, and adherence to customary norms in interactions both within and between city-states. Even when these norms were violated, the framework itself provided expectations for justice, reciprocity, and political legitimacy. The prolonged conflict between Athens and Sparta destroyed these conventions, demonstrating that power, not principle, governed human affairs once social and military pressures became extreme. Thucydides' accounts vividly illustrate the extent of political and moral collapse. In Corcyra's civil war of 427 BCE, democratic and oligarchic factions turned on each other with unprecedented brutality, murdering neighbors, violating religious sanctuaries, and disregarding familial bonds. Similarly, the Athenian destruction of Melos in 416 BCE showed that small states could be annihilated solely on the calculus of expediency and power. Acts of reprisal and war crimes became routine, eroding the moral and legal underpinnings of the polis and demonstrating that extended warfare reshaped societies themselves. Thucydides' observation that war, which takes away the comfortable provision of daily life, is a hard master and assimilates most men's characters to their conditions, captures the profound transformation. Citizens hardened, societies brutalized, and law and justice became subordinate to survival and ambition. Internal factionalism intensified dramatically during the war. Previously, tension between oligarchic and democratic elements existed, but was usually contained within institutional norms. The Peloponnesian War transformed these divisions into violent civil conflicts, stasis, that frequently proved bloodier than interstate warfare. Athens and Sparta deliberately exacerbated these fissures, intervening in allied and neutral polis to promote factions aligned with their strategic objectives, Sparta supporting oligarchs, Athens backing democrats. Local autonomy eroded as cities became theaters of great power rivalry. The brief unity achieved against Persia in the early 5th century BCE vanished entirely. Greek states spent decades killing one another in internecine violence far exceeding the intensity of conflicts against external enemies. Sparta's post-war attempts to impose hegemony further illustrated the unsustainability of external control over autonomous polis. Military governors, harmasts, and client oligarchies, dikarchies, enforced Spartan policies across Greece. Yet within a decade, Athens, Thebes, Corinth, and Argos formed the anti-Spartan coalition that sparked the Corinthian War, 395 to 387 BCE. Sparta's military victory had not resolved underlying political instability. The war's structural and cultural consequences ensured persistent conflict. Throughout the 4th century BCE, Greek states continued constant warfare, from Theban hegemony to the rise of Macedon, demonstrating that the Peloponnesian War had permanently destabilized the interstate system. City-states proved incapable of lasting hegemony or peaceful coexistence, and power, rather than law or custom, became the defining arbiter of relations, setting the stage for external domination. The war thus represents a systemic political crisis, the collapse of civic norms, the weaponization of internal divisions, and the impossibility of sustainable governance or interstate cooperation. The Peloponnesian War destroyed not only Athens and Sparta, but the classical polis ideal, creating a fragmented, cynical, and militarized Greek world in which no city-state could guarantee internal stability or external security. This political transformation accompanies the war's military innovations, as strategic pressures forced both tactical and organizational adaptation that permanently altered Greek warfare, setting the stage for subsequent developments in both arms and strategy. The Peloponnesian War accelerated military innovation in unprecedented ways, transforming Greek warfare from relatively ritualized engagements into a more complex, totalizing system of armed conflict. Early in the war, naval battles relied on straightforward tactics, massed trireme formations, frontal ramming attacks, and attempts to break the enemy line via the Deekplus maneuver. By the war's conclusion, however, fleets had adopted far more sophisticated techniques. Athens employed double-line formations at Arginusi to prevent flanking, while integrated amphibious operations, combining naval support with land forces, became increasingly common, as seen in the campaigns of Brasidas in Thrace and Demosthenes in the Aegean. Economic warfare also emerged as a strategic tool. Blockades, such as Lysander's deployment in the Hellespont, aimed not merely at defeating opposing fleets, but at strangling cities' resources, demonstrating that warfare now targeted entire societies, not just armies. Brutality escalated correspondingly. Earlier conventions, such as rescuing shipwrecked sailors or returning the dead, eroded. Naval victories were increasingly total. Captured crews were executed, ships destroyed, and psychological terror imposed on populations. Land warfare likewise evolved. Traditional hoplite dominance was challenged by light-armed troops, whose mobility and flexibility proved decisive in certain terrains and tactical situations. At Sphacteria, Athenian peltasts harassed Spartan hoplites to surrender, undermining assumptions that heavy infantry alone determined victory. This foreshadowed 4th-century combined arms strategies, later perfected by Iphicrates, and laid the groundwork for standard integration of hoplites, cavalry, and light infantry. Fortifications and siegecraft also advanced dramatically. Early 5th-century siege warfare was rudimentary, but by the war's end, engineers constructed circumvallation walls, developed counter-siege techniques, and implemented sustained starvation campaigns. Cities with competent leadership and motivated populations, like Syracuse, demonstrated that defensive innovation could offset even Athenian naval superiority, highlighting the interplay of technology, strategy, and civic morale. Strategic thinking itself became more sophisticated. Campaigns shifted from seasonal expeditions to year-round operations, exemplified by Sparta's occupation of Decilia. Economic targeting, including the systematic destruction of olive groves, mines, and trade routes, combined with external funding from Persia to sustain prolonged naval and military operations, effectively expanded warfare to encompass the entirety of society and economy. This conception of total war exceeded earlier Greek norms, presaging the operational art of the Hellenistic period. Philip II of Macedon and Alexander the Great directly built upon these innovations, particularly in combined arms integration and strategic campaign planning, showing clear continuity from Peloponnesian experimentation to Macedonian conquest. The Peloponnesian War thus represents a critical turning point. Greek armies and navies learned that victory required more than courage and discipline. It demanded planning, flexibility, and an understanding that conflict now involved entire societies and economies as legitimate targets. Warfare had evolved from ceremonial clashes between hoplite phalanxes into something approaching total war, where survival depended on strategic vision, technological adaptation, and ruthless exploitation of both material and psychological factors. This transformation would shape the character of Greek, and later Macedonian, military practice for generations. The innovations of this prolonged conflict were accompanied by parallel intellectual upheaval, as the war's apparent meaninglessness and brutality compelled Greek thinkers to question traditional morality, religion, and political assumptions, setting the stage for a profound cultural and philosophical reckoning. The Peloponnesian War profoundly reshaped Greek culture and intellectual life, accelerating a crisis of values that would reverberate for generations. Traditional religious beliefs, already under scrutiny by pre-Socratic thinkers, lost credibility amid the war's unrelenting catastrophes. The plague that struck Athens between 430 and 426 BC, it killed tens of thousands despite priestly assurances of divine favor, demonstrating that ritual and sacrifice could not avert human suffering. Thucydides' historiography reflected this shift. He systematically excluded divine causation, insisting on material, human explanations for events. His work established a rational, empirical approach to history, emphasizing causation, power, and human decision-making rather than fate or the gods. Intellectual movements responded to and were shaped by the moral crises of wartime Athens. The sophists, itinerant teachers questioning traditional norms, thrived in this context. They taught rhetoric, relativistic ethics, and practical power analysis, famously arguing that justice was conventional and that might often determine right, a perspective epitomized by Thrasymachus' arguments in Plato's Republic. War's brutality lent plausibility to these ideas. Massacres at Melos and Corcyra demonstrated that conventional morality often had little effect on outcomes, and persuasive skill could determine survival and advantage. Athenian culture mirrored these crises. Euripides' tragedies, including the Trojan women, Hecuba, and the Bacchae, grappled with war's human cost, imperial hubris, and the collapse of ethical restraints, often critiquing Athens indirectly through myth. Aristophanes' comedies, particularly Lysistrata and Peace, satirized political incompetence, military mismanagement, and popular war fatigue, blending humor with social commentary. These works reflected a society struggling to reconcile civic ideals with harsh reality, using literature to process trauma and critique leadership. Philosophically, the war catalyzed Socrates' mission to interrogate convention, virtue, and justice. The crisis of values, the evident gap between law, morality, and effective power, rendered questions of ethical authority urgent. Socrates' association with figures in the 30 Tyrants, including his student Critias, later contributed to his execution, highlighting the dangerous intersection of philosophy and political turbulence. His students, Plato and Xenophon, experienced Athens' collapse firsthand. Plato's Republic emerges as a response, a utopian exploration of ideal governance designed to avoid the failures of both democracy and Spartan militarism observed during the war. The Peloponnesian War undermined confidence in political structures, religious norms, and ethical absolutes, creating intellectual space for Hellenistic philosophies, Stoicism, Epicureanism, and Cynicism, which prioritized personal ethics, self-mastery, and inner tranquility over civic engagement. In effect, the war catalyzed a retreat from the polis-centered worldview, signaling the end of classical Greek confidence in collective moral and political order. The conflict demonstrated that war's brutality does not merely alter borders or regimes, it transforms society's foundational values. Greek thinkers, playwrights, and citizens confronted the reality that survival, power, and human nature often outweighed traditional ideals of justice, piety, and civic virtue, reshaping intellectual life in ways that would influence the Mediterranean world for centuries. The intellectual and cultural upheaval left by the war set the stage for 4th-century developments, Sparta's fragile hegemony, Theban ascendancy, and ultimately Macedonian conquest, illustrating how exhausted civilizations invite external domination and new political orders. Sparta's victory in 404 BCE marked the apex of its military power, but it immediately confronted the challenge for which its society was poorly prepared: ruling an empire. Unlike Athens, which had centuries of experience administering tribute, regulating trade, and integrating subject states into a coherent political network, Sparta lacked bureaucratic mechanisms, institutional norms, or ideological justification for imperial governance. Its victory depended on battlefield discipline and hoplite prowess, not on the subtleties of administration or diplomacy. To maintain control over former Athenian allies, Sparta relied on a system of dikarches, 10-man oligarchic councils, backed by harmasts, Spartan military governors who enforced Sparta's will. These governments, often staffed with local elites loyal to Sparta, ruled through coercion, executing or exiling democratic opponents, and confiscating property. Lysander, the architect of Sparta's post-war order, consolidated extraordinary personal authority. In several cities, he received quasi-divine honors and accumulated wealth through gifts from grateful oligarchs, a direct violation of Lycurgan austerity. Conservative Spartans viewed these developments with alarm. Equality among Spartiates and communal simplicity formed the bedrock of their social identity, yet Lysander's personal enrichment and local glorification undermined these principles. The dikarches' oppressive methods immediately bred resentment. Unlike Athens' empire, which extracted tribute but generally allowed civic autonomy, Sparta's system intruded into local governance, subordinated majority populations to unpopular oligarchs, and interfered in daily affairs. Economic exploitation accompanied political control. Contributions for military operations were enforced rigorously, and local oligarchs frequently enriched themselves with impunity. These practices created widespread hostility and delegitimized Sparta's ideological claim of liberating Greek cities from Athenian tyranny. Sparta's structural weaknesses compounded its difficulties. The city-state's education system, the Aegean, produced excellent hoplites but offered no training in administration, law, or diplomacy. Sparta had no merchant class, bureaucratic expertise, or tradition of civic negotiation. Stationing harmasts and Spartiates throughout the Aegean dispersed its limited manpower and exposed citizens to foreign influences, eroding traditional customs and social cohesion. Naval oversight, trade regulation, and mediation among local factions proved particularly challenging. The Spartans' military dominance, while unrivaled in pitched battles, could not compensate for these deficits. Consequently, opposition quickly coalesced. Within 5 years, major Greek powers, including Thebes, Corinth, Athens, recovering from its defeat, and Argos, formed a coalition to challenge Spartan authority, triggering the Corinthian War, 395 to 387 BCE. Sparta found itself in a position eerily similar to Athens before 431 BCE, a dominant military power confronted by widespread political resistance and persistent ideological hostility. Its inability to translate battlefield supremacy into sustainable governance revealed a central paradox of hegemonic transition. Victory does not automatically produce stability. Sparta's post-war experience illustrates the inherent difficulties victorious powers face in transforming coercive success into legitimate rule. Military excellence and imperial ambition proved insufficient without institutional capacity, ideological legitimacy, or administrative skill. The Dicarches, Lysander's personal accumulation of power, and the accompanying resentment among subject states created conditions for renewed conflict, demonstrating that controlling conquered populations requires fundamentally different capabilities than defeating them in war. The failures of Spartan hegemony, internal corruption, and external resistance set the stage for political crises and renewed warfare that would ultimately undermine Sparta itself, paving the way for Theban ascendancy and a dramatic reordering of Greek interstate relations. In 395 BCE, a coalition of Greek states, Thebes, Corinth, Athens, Argos, and several smaller polis, launched the Corinthian War to challenge Sparta's newly established hegemony. The causes of the conflict were multiple and intertwined. The oppressive Dicarches imposed by Sparta across former Athenian allies bred widespread resentment. Local elites and common citizens alike resisted Spartan-imposed oligarchies. Thebes sought autonomy in Boeotia, chafing under Spartan interference, while Corinth resented its wartime alliance with Sparta, feeling that its contributions in the Peloponnesian War had not been adequately rewarded. Remarkably, Athens had recovered sufficiently to participate. Persian funding enabled the rebuilding of the Long Walls and the construction of a fleet of approximately 100 triremes. This revival reflected both the city's resilience and the enduring economic capacity of its citizenry, even after decades of demographic and material devastation. Persia, observing Greek exhaustion, intervened with calculated pragmatism. Having previously supported Sparta to weaken Athens, Persian satraps now financed the anti-Spartan coalition to prevent Sparta from consolidating lasting hegemony. This balance of power strategy ensured that no Greek state would become strong enough to threaten Persian interests in Asia Minor. Persian gold flowed into the coffers of Athens and its allies, underwriting armies and navies that would challenge Sparta on multiple fronts. The war's most notable land engagement occurred at Chaeronea in 394 BCE, where Spartan king Agesilaus, recalled from a campaign in Asia Minor, defeated coalition forces but suffered heavy casualties, a tactical victory with strategic costs. Decisive developments, however, came at sea. The Battle of Cnidus, also in 394 BCE, marked the permanent end of Spartan naval dominance. Commanded by Conon, the sole surviving Athenian admiral from the disaster at Aegospotami, the combined Persian-Athenian fleet destroyed the Spartan navy, capturing or sinking dozens of ships. Sparta, historically reliant on its hoplites but always weaker at sea, could never recover maritime supremacy, leaving its capacity to project power across the Aegean irreparably diminished. The Corinthian War eventually settled into a stalemate, draining Spartan resources and exposing the limits of its military dominance. In 387 BCE, Sparta, recognizing that continued warfare was unsustainable, turned to Persia for resolution. The resulting Peace of Antalcidas, known as the King's Peace, was dictated entirely by Persian King Artaxerxes II. The treaty ceded explicit control of Greek cities in Asia Minor to Persia, reversing centuries of Greek victories since the Persian Wars, and mandated autonomy for all other Greek polis, effectively dissolving regional alliances such as the Boeotian League. For Sparta, the peace represented a strategic necessity, but also an ideological humiliation. The victors of the Peloponnesian War bowed before a foreign king to maintain hegemony. The King's Peace illustrated how quickly the allure of hegemonic power could fade when former liberators became oppressors. Greek internal rivalries, exhaustion, and mutual distrust left the region vulnerable to external manipulation. Persia, once expelled from Europe, now dictated terms to the most powerful Greek military states, a testament to the enduring significance of realpolitik and the limits of military victory unaccompanied by sustainable political control. The treaty temporarily suppressed overt hostilities, but Sparta's continued reliance on intimidation and oligarchic imposition ensured that conflict was far from resolved. The stage was set for Theban resistance, which would exploit Spartan overreach and ultimately challenge its dominance, leading to the catastrophic defeat at Leuctra and the rise of a new Greek military power. By the 370s BCE, Thebes, long overshadowed by Athens and Sparta, emerged as Greece's preeminent military power, exploiting both Spartan overreach and its own tactical innovation. After the King's Peace, Sparta maintained dominance through intimidation, most flagrantly occupying Thebes' citadel, the Cadmea, in 382 BC during peacetime, a stark violation of Greek norms. In 379 BCE, Theban exiles returned, expelled the Spartan garrison, and reconstituted the Boeotian League under Theban leadership, restoring regional influence and security. Thebes' resurgence depended on visionary generals Pelopidas and Epaminondas. They institutionalized innovation both organizationally and tactically. The Sacred Band, an elite unit of 300 men formed from paired lovers, leveraged personal bonds to ensure cohesion and extraordinary morale, demonstrating a deliberate fusion of social structure with military efficacy. More consequentially, Epaminondas revolutionized hoplite warfare through formation and concentration of force. Whereas traditional phalanxes were uniform in depth with the right wing strongest, he developed the oblique formation. The left wing was deepened to 50 ranks while the right wing refused engagement, advancing at an angle to achieve local superiority. This tactic focused overwhelming force at a decisive point, capable of shattering even the most disciplined army. The oblique phalanx was tested at the Battle of Leuctra in July 371 BCE. Facing approximately 10,000 Spartans, including only 700 Spartiates, a stark indicator of demographic decline, Epaminondas concentrated his deep left wing, led by the Sacred Band, against the Spartan right, where King Cleombrotus commanded. The Spartans, long undefeated in pitched battle for over 2 centuries, could not withstand the focused assault. Their line collapsed. Cleombrotus fell alongside roughly 400 Spartiates, losses that Sparta could not replace. Leuctra destroyed Sparta's aura of invincibility permanently, proving that tactical innovation and concentrated force could outweigh reputation and numerical advantage. Following this decisive victory, Epaminondas extended Theban influence into the Peloponnese. In 370 to 369 BCE, he liberated Messenia, ending 3 centuries of Spartan Helot subjugation and establishing the free city of Messene. Without Messenia's agricultural output and labor, Sparta's economic base collapsed. Combined with the persistent decline in Spartan citizen numbers, approximately 1,000 Spartiates by this period, Sparta lacked the demographic and economic capacity to reclaim regional dominance. Thebes subsequently dominated Greece for roughly a decade, asserting leadership through both military and political influence, until Epaminondas' death at the Battle of Mantinea in 362 BC. His demise marked the abrupt end of Theban hegemony. No successor could replicate his combination of tactical brilliance, organizational innovation, and political vision. Leuctra demonstrates the power of strategic ingenuity to overturn centuries of entrenched military prestige. Tactical innovation, elite unit cohesion, and decisive leadership not only won battles, but reshaped social and economic structures, highlighting how military outcomes can have immediate and transformative societal consequences. The Sacred Band exemplified the integration of personal bonds and professional duty, while the liberation of Messenia underscored the link between battlefield success and systemic change. The brief period of Theban ascendancy underscores a broader lesson. Even successful hegemonies in post-Peloponnesian Greece were inherently fragile, leaving a political vacuum and military opportunity that Macedon would ultimately exploit to unify and dominate the Greek world. By the mid-4th century BCE, the structural limitations of the Greek polis system were unmistakable. The Peloponnesian War had established a predictable cycle of hegemony and collapse. One city-state would achieve dominance through prolonged, exhausting warfare, attempt to impose its political and military order on others, provoke coalitions of resistant states, and ultimately exhaust itself fighting that resistance. Athens, Sparta, and Thebes each briefly dominated the Greek world. Athens before 431 BCE, Sparta from 404 to 371 BCE, and Thebes from 371 to 362 BC. Yet each hegemony collapsed within decades, leaving behind a trail of depopulated cities, depleted treasuries, and fractured alliances. Demographic decline profoundly reshaped warfare and civic life. Citizen armies could no longer sustain long campaigns, and mercenary soldiers, or mistos, became increasingly common. This professionalization of warfare increased tactical sophistication, but weakened the traditional connection between military service and civic responsibility. Interstate relations operated almost exclusively on calculations of power and self-interest. The King's Peace of 387 BCE illustrated this harsh reality. Persia, external to Greek culture, dictated terms to Greek city-states, reversing centuries of collective independence and demonstrating that even regional powers were vulnerable to exhaustion and manipulation. The intellectual consequences mirrored the political and military exhaustion. 5th-century thinkers had focused on governance, justice, and civic engagement within the polis. In contrast, 4th-century philosophy, cynicism, early Stoicism, and Epicureanism shifted toward personal ethics and the cultivation of inner resilience, implicitly acknowledging that political life offered few lasting solutions. The polis system's structural weaknesses, compounded by war fatigue and mistrust, created a strategic vacuum ripe for external exploitation. Philip II of Macedon capitalized on this exhaustion. By combining professional cavalry, a reformed infantry phalanx, and siege technology, he systematically conquered the divided Greek city-states. At Chaeronea in 338 BCE, Philip decisively defeated the combined forces of Athens and Thebes. Despite Demosthenes' passionate Philippic's warning of the Macedonian threat, Greek mistrust and exhaustion prevented unified resistance. While city-states persisted as local administrative units, meaningful political independence had ended. Alexander the Great and his successors ruled Greece as conquerors rather than fellow polis citizens. The Peloponnesian War revealed that the city-state model, once a symbol of Greek autonomy and civic pride, could not sustain large-scale cooperation or enduring hegemony. Its structural exhaustion rendered Greece vulnerable to external domination, creating conditions in which Macedonian conquest was not merely possible, but almost inevitable. A cautionary lesson in how systemic fragility can determine historical outcomes. Thucydides, exiled after failing to prevent the Spartan general Brasidas from capturing Amphipolis, transformed personal misfortune into a lasting intellectual legacy with his history of the Peloponnesian War. Born around 460 BCE into a wealthy Athenian family that owned Thracian gold mines, Thucydides combined first-hand military and political experience with unprecedented analytical rigor. Unlike Herodotus, whose histories mixed anecdote, myth, and divine causation, Thucydides demanded empirical evidence, eyewitness testimony, and a strict focus on human agency. For him, gods played no role in determining events. War, politics, and human character alone explained historical outcomes. This secular, rational approach established a standard for historical inquiry that resonates to this day. Thucydides meticulously separated underlying causes from immediate pretexts. He identified the growth of Athenian power and the resultant Spartan fear as the war's structural cause, cataloging border disputes and specific incidents only as triggers. He traveled extensively, interviewing participants from both sides, cross-checking accounts, and discarding what he judged unreliable. His methodology extended to documentary evidence, incorporating treaties, inscriptions, and diplomatic correspondence, further grounding his narrative in verifiable material. This commitment to evidence over tradition represented a revolutionary departure from earlier historiography. One of Thucydides' most innovative contributions was the reconstructed speech. Recognizing he could not reproduce exact words spoken at political assemblies or military councils, he crafted speeches reflecting what speakers must have said, given their circumstances and objectives. These reconstructions, such as Pericles' funeral oration, the Melian dialogue, and the Corinthian embassy's speech at Sparta, served as analytical tools to explore reasoning, persuasion, and political psychology. Through them, Thucydides illuminated not just events but the logic driving decisions and the influence of fear, ambition, and power on human action. His work also advanced political realism. His oft-cited observation that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must articulated the mechanics of power centuries before Machiavelli. The brutal civil strife at Corcyra exemplified his attention to how war erodes social bonds, corrupts language, and degrades values, offering enduring insights into the darker dimensions of human nature. By analyzing both interstate and intrastate conflict, Thucydides revealed patterns in human behavior that transcended specific events, establishing history as a tool for understanding timeless principles of power, strategy, and governance. Though he died before completing his account, ending abruptly in 411 BCE, 7 years before Athens' final defeat, Thucydides' methodological innovations shaped all subsequent historiography. Xenophon's Hellenica continued the narrative but lacked Thucydides' analytical depth and systematic approach. Through his rigorous empirical method, analytical reconstructions, and emphasis on human causation, Thucydides established the foundations of scientific history. His work remains essential for historians, political theorists, and strategists, demonstrating how disciplined analysis of human behavior and power can illuminate both past events and enduring principles of statecraft. Thucydides' synthesis of evidence, reason, and insight thus not only chronicled the Peloponnesian War, but transformed how humans understand history itself, setting the stage for centuries of political thought, philosophical reflection, and strategic analysis. The Peloponnesian War profoundly shaped ancient Greek political thought, providing philosophers and statesmen with dramatic examples of both civic achievement and catastrophic failure. Plato, c. 428 to 348 BCE, born during the war's early years and witnessing Athens' ultimate defeat and the terror of the 30 tyrants, structured his republic in direct response to these events. His ideal state sought to synthesize Athens' intellectual heritage with Sparta's disciplined communalism, producing a system in which philosopher kings ruled through wisdom rather than popular whim or brute force. Plato's critique of democracy emerged from his wartime observations. Democratic assemblies repeatedly made disastrous strategic decisions, as in the Sicilian expedition, executed victorious generals, as after Arginusi, and fell prey to demagogues such as Cleon and Alcibiades. The war's repeated failures convinced Plato that governance by majority opinion alone could not achieve justice or strategic prudence. Yet he equally rejected Sparta's militarism, recognizing that martial excellence without philosophical guidance could devolve into tyranny, exemplified by the 30 tyrants' oligarchic brutality. Aristotle, 384 to 322 BCE, Plato's student and tutor to Alexander the Great, approached Greek political systems with comparative analysis in his Politics, much of it informed by the Peloponnesian War's lessons. He studied why democracies and oligarchies succumbed to stasis, how class conflict and factionalism destabilized city-states, and why moderation proved politically fragile. Examples drawn from the war: Athens' imperial overreach provoking resentment, Sparta's rigid social hierarchy relying on constant Hellid oppression, and Corcyra's internecine massacres demonstrated the practical consequences of political imbalance. Aristotle concluded that mixed constitutions, balancing the interests of different social classes, offered the most stable governance, reflecting the insight that pure democracy and pure oligarchy both failed catastrophically when tested by prolonged conflict. Beyond philosophy, the war influenced historians, statesmen, and orators. Xenophon, a mercenary and admirer of Sparta, analyzed constitutions to extract lessons on civic organization and military-political synergy. Isocrates, writing in the 4th century BCE, argued in Panegyricus that Greeks should unite under combined Athenian-Spartan leadership to confront Persia, illustrating how the war inspired some thinkers to consider strategic redirection rather than mere avoidance of conflict. Later Hellenistic and Roman commentators read the Peloponnesian War as a cautionary tale, emphasizing the dangers of unchecked ambition, alliance fragility, and the costs of hegemony. Polybius, for instance, praised Rome's constitutional stability as a corrective to Greek internecine chaos, demonstrating the war's enduring analytical value. The war's brutality and apparent meaninglessness prompted two intertwined philosophical responses: a turn toward rigorous political analysis aimed at preventing similar disasters, and, simultaneously, skepticism about civic engagement that encouraged philosophers to explore personal ethics as a refuge from systemic corruption. The Peloponnesian War thus became both a laboratory for political theory and a moral warning, teaching that human nature, power, and institutional design are inseparable in understanding statecraft. By examining Plato, Aristotle, and other thinkers, one sees that the Peloponnesian War was not merely a historical episode but a catalyst for reflection on governance, power, and the limits of human foresight. These lessons would echo far beyond Greece, influencing Renaissance and Enlightenment theorists and shaping modern strategic thought about war, leadership, and the fragility of political institutions. Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War entered Western consciousness gradually, its impact growing steadily through Renaissance humanism and subsequent scholarship. Latin translations circulated among scholars who admired his secular, rational approach to political and military analysis, contrasting sharply with the moralizing and often miraculous narratives of medieval chronicles. Renaissance thinkers recognized in Thucydides a model for understanding power as it functioned in practice rather than as it ought to function in theory. Niccolò Machiavelli, in particular, drew heavily on Thucydidean realism. The blunt pragmatism of the Melian dialogue, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must, mirrored the insights Machiavelli would later codify in The Prince, emphasizing that moral ideals often yield to necessity in the calculus of statecraft. In 17th-century England, Thomas Hobbes produced the first English translation, 1629, finding in Thucydides confirmation of his theories on human nature, conflict, and the necessity of centralized authority to prevent anarchic violence. Leviathan reflects Thucydidean understanding that war erodes civilization, fear drives political behavior, and survival often dictates choices beyond ethical considerations. Enlightenment thinkers engage Thucydides with a variety of lessons. Some emphasize the perils of unchecked democracy, pointing to Athenian assemblies' disastrous decisions as evidence for constitutional restraints on popular rule. Others viewed Athens' imperial overreach as a warning against colonial hubris, highlighting the dangers inherent when expansion provokes widespread resistance. Modern scholarship treated Thucydides both as a primary source and as a methodological exemplar. German historicists such as Leopold von Ranke and Theodor Mommsen praised his empirical rigor, source criticism, and analytical precision. The rise of political realism in 20th-century international relations rediscovered Thucydides as a foundational theorist. Concepts central to realist theory, balance of power, security dilemmas, preventive war, appear repeatedly in his narrative, demonstrating that he identified enduring principles of state behavior millennia before the formal discipline existed. During the Cold War, strategists compared Athens and Sparta to the US and the Soviet Union, two rival powers with incompatible systems, alliance networks, and ideological opposition, where fear and mistrust risked catastrophic escalation. In the 21st century, the Thucydides trap entered policy discourse, framing analyses of U.S.-China tensions in historical perspective. Today, Thucydides remains essential reading in military academies, diplomatic training, and strategic studies programs worldwide. His work demonstrates that the dynamics of fear, ambition, and power operate consistently across time, and that understanding these dynamics is critical for managing modern alliances, nuclear deterrence, and international crises. The Peloponnesian War, though fought between small Greek city-states over 2,400 years ago, continues to inform the strategies and policies of global powers, proving that lessons derived from meticulous historical observation retain practical relevance across millennia. The enduring influence of Thucydides demonstrates that ancient warfare and diplomacy were more than historical episodes. They became analytical templates, shaping strategic thought from Renaissance Italy to contemporary geopolitics, underscoring the Peloponnesian War's continuing civilizational significance. The Peloponnesian War offers a template for understanding recurring patterns in interstate conflict and hegemonic competition, illuminating dynamics that resurface across centuries. The Athens-Sparta rivalry, for example, mirrors later historical contests: Rome versus Carthage, Britain against continental powers such as France and Germany, and the Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. Each case involved ideological differences, systemic incompatibility, dense alliance networks, and mutual fear of the rising power upsetting the established order. Thucydides' observation that rising powers often threaten existing hegemons, provoking conflict, forms the conceptual foundation of the Thucydides trap, evident in Athens challenging Sparta, Rome challenging Carthage, Germany challenging Britain before World War I, and contemporary concerns over U.S.-China relations. Debates persist as to whether such conflicts are inevitable or whether wise leadership and robust institutions can mediate power transitions peacefully. Alliance dynamics demonstrated by the Peloponnesian War remain strikingly relevant. Hegemonic behavior provoked resentment among allies, as seen in Athens' empire and Sparta's dikarchis, while coalitions could drag powers into conflicts they might not have chosen, exemplified by Corinth compelling Sparta into broader war. Prolonged campaigns often eroded alliance cohesion, a pattern evident in the fragmentation of the Peloponnesian League and mirrored in modern alliance strains under extended military commitments. Economic warfare emerged decisively. Athens relied on naval blockades, Sparta targeted grain and silver, and Persia's subsidies shaped naval outcomes. These strategies presage modern economic sanctions, supply chain manipulation, and financial coercion as instruments of state power. The war also illustrates progressive escalation and the brutalization of conflict. Initial expectations of limited engagement gave way to prolonged attrition, widespread civilian suffering, and total war tactics, foreshadowing patterns later observed in World Wars I and II. Domestic political effects further reinforce the war's lessons. Athens' oligarchic coup and recurrent stasis reveal how external conflicts can destabilize internal governance, paralleling how modern states often face political crises during extended military engagements. Finally, the Peloponnesian War underscores the limits of victory. Neither Athens nor Sparta achieved durable peace. Exhaustion created power vacuums exploited by Thebes and later Macedon, reminiscent of how post-World War I exhaustion facilitated radical ideologies' rise. Strategic, economic, and political lessons resonate across millennia, demonstrating that while contexts change, core human, institutional, and interstate dynamics persist. If these patterns, rising power threatening established order, alliances generating unintended consequences, and wars escalating beyond initial expectations, repeat over 2,500 years, the Peloponnesian War compels reflection. Can humanity learn from history, or are civilizations perpetually condemned to reenact the same cycles of ambition, fear, and conflict? Having traced these recurring dynamics, the final task is to synthesize the war's enduring lessons on strategy, governance, and human nature. affirming why the Peloponnesian War remains an essential reference for understanding Western political and military history. The Sicilian expedition of 415 BCE exemplifies imperial overreach at its most catastrophic. Athens, flush with confidence after decades of naval dominance, committed 200 ships and roughly half its hoplite force, approximately 20,000 infantry, to a campaign across 800 miles of hostile waters, targeting Sicily with ambiguous strategic aims. Whether the goal was defending Segesta, conquering Syracuse, or asserting dominance over the entire island, Athens lacked a clear plan tailored to any single objective. Moreover, the city-state underestimated the sophistication, political cohesion, and resilience of the Syracusan defenders, creating a mismatch between ambition and operational capacity. Logistical complexity compounded the challenge. Maintaining supply lines over such distances without secure bases left Athenian forces vulnerable, while divided command among Alcibiades, Nicias, and Lamachus introduced conflicting strategies that paralyzed decision-making at critical moments. Nicias' reluctance to retreat, even when defeat became evident, transformed a dangerous gamble into total disaster, culminating in the annihilation of the expeditionary force. The lessons of Sicily resonate beyond ancient history. First, distance magnifies logistical risk. Projecting power far from secure bases stretches supply lines, limits maneuverability, and leaves forces exposed to environmental and operational hazards. Second, strategic clarity is indispensable. Objectives must be singular, achievable, and internally coherent. Attempting multiple contradictory aims dissipates effort and invites failure. Third, understanding the adversary is paramount. Athens' failure to assess Syracusan military competence, political resolve, and potential alliances with Corinth directly contributed to defeat. Fourth, unity of command is essential. Fragmented leadership breeds paralysis and inconsistent execution, particularly in high-stakes, distant campaigns. Finally, strategic flexibility, the willingness to recognize and withdraw from untenable positions, is critical. Nicias' adherence to honor and sunk cost considerations prevented prudent evacuation, illustrating how psychological and political pressures can override rational decision-making. Modern parallels abound. Napoleon's 1812 Russian campaign, American operations in Vietnam, the Soviet-Afghan War, and recent interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan reflect the same dynamics. Overextension, unclear objectives, underestimation of local conditions, divided or inflexible leadership, and the inability to disengage in time. Each case underscores a persistent challenge in strategic planning. Despite centuries of historical examples, the allure of expansion, domestic political pressures, and overconfidence continue to induce powers to repeat overreach. The Sicilian expedition demonstrates that imperial ambition, when detached from operational reality, invariably leads to disaster. Distance, clarity, intelligence, command, and flexibility are timeless principles. Ignoring them risks repeating history's most infamous strategic failures. Beyond imperial overreach, the Peloponnesian War also illuminates the complexities of alliances, how they empower, constrain, and sometimes entrap states in conflicts not of their choosing, requiring equal attention to diplomacy and coalition management alongside military competence. Alliance systems, while designed to provide security and collective strength, often produce the opposite effect: entrapment of great powers in conflicts driven more by allied interests than their own. The Peloponnesian War offers classic examples. In Corinth's case, its threat to leave the Peloponnesian League compelled Sparta into war with Athens despite initial reluctance from Spartan kings, illustrating how smaller states can manipulate hegemonic powers into pursuing conflicts that serve the allies' agendas. Athens, conversely, found itself drawn into confrontation by obligations to allies such as Corcyra and Potidaea. Defending these cities, strategically peripheral yet symbolically significant, consumed enormous resources and escalated tensions toward full-scale war. Later, Sicilian cities' appeals, notably Segesta and Leontini, prompted the catastrophic Sicilian expedition, demonstrating how alliance pressures can drive powers into distant campaigns of questionable strategic value. This dynamic reflects a timeless strategic dilemma, moral hazard. Smaller allies, shielded by the protection of a dominant state, may undertake provocative actions they would avoid independently. The great power, committed to maintaining credibility, often feels obliged to respond, stretching itself into conflicts peripheral to its core interests. Modern history mirrors this pattern. World War I erupted in part due to alliance entrapment. Austria-Hungary's conflict with Serbia activated a cascade of allied obligations, drawing Germany, Russia, France, and Britain into a continental war none initially sought. During the Cold War, US and Soviet commitments generated proxy conflicts worldwide. Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Angola, where the superpowers' direct interests were secondary to alliance obligations. Even in the 21st century, NATO expansion and the 2008 Russo-Georgian War highlight enduring questions. Does formal alliance membership compel intervention even when conflicts originate from local actors' ambitions? The Peloponnesian experience underscores that alliances require constant management and strategic calibration. Athens' Delian League evolved from voluntary coalition to coercive empire, provoking revolts and overextension after Sicily. Sparta's Peloponnesian League, while generally respecting autonomy, faced defections from Corinth and Thebes after 421 BCE when members perceived betrayal. Effective leadership requires balancing credibility, demonstrating commitment to protect allies against restraint, avoiding entrapment in wars initiated by members' initiatives. Athens overemphasized credibility, sacrificing strategic discretion. Sparta sometimes leaned toward restraint, risking loss of trust. Contemporary alliance systems, from NATO to US partnerships in Asia, confront the same tension, maintaining credibility without enabling reckless allied behavior, sharing burdens equitably, and preserving cohesion among actors with divergent priorities. The Peloponnesian War thus demonstrates that alliance politics contains inherent contradictions. Leaders must navigate a constant strategic tightrope, defend allies without overextending, honor commitments without becoming ensnared, and adjust continuously as members' ambitions and circumstances evolve. Beyond alliance dynamics, the war reveals another critical driver of escalation: fear, honor, and interest, Thucydides' famous trinity, showing how psychological and political motivations can override rational calculation and propel conflicts even when accommodation might serve all parties better. Thucydides' analysis of the Peloponnesian War illuminated the profound and often contradictory forces shaping state behavior, distilled into what he identified as the trinity of fear, honor, and interest. These three drivers explain why rational actors, even when aware of risks, frequently escalate conflicts beyond necessity, a framework that remains foundational in modern international relations theory. Fear dominated Spartan decision-making. Sparta perceived Athens' growing power as existentially threatening. Athens' naval expansion, fortification of the long walls, and ability to project force across the Aegean created the perception that Spartan dominance and security were imperiled. From Athens' perspective, these measures were largely defensive, ensuring secure food supply and resilience against invasion. Yet from Sparta's standpoint, they were aggressive, triggering a security dilemma in which one side's defensive measures provoke escalating countermeasures in the other. Both sides' fears were rational in context, but mutually reinforcing, creating a spiral toward large-scale war. Honor, reputation, credibility, and prestige often drove decisions that pure interest calculation would reject. Athens' enforcement of the Megarian decree, economically minor, reflected a determination not to appear weak. Intervention at Potidaea demonstrated Spartan loyalty to allies despite high costs. The Melian dialogue exemplifies honor overriding utility. Melos held no strategic value, yet Athens demanded submission to affirm its supremacy and signal that neutrality would not be tolerated. Honor concerns compel states to act to preserve credibility, often escalating conflicts or rejecting compromises that appear as backing down. Interest, the pursuit of tangible material benefits, remained the rational foundation. Athens' empire delivered tribute funding its democracy, military resources, and control of trade routes generating wealth. Sparta's actions sought to prevent Athenian hegemony from threatening Peloponnesian security and leadership. Yet interest frequently conflicted with fear and honor. The Sicilian expedition illustrates this. Materially, conquest offered limited benefit relative to enormous risk. However, honor demanded demonstration of power, while fear of losing momentum and allies drove Athens forward. Modern strategic thought continues to employ Thucydides' trinity. Nuclear deterrence theory hinges on interest, avoiding annihilation, fear of adversary capabilities, and honor, maintaining credibility of deterrent threats. Contemporary great power competition, such as U.S.-China relations, similarly intertwines economic and security interests, fear of shifting power balances, and honor concerns over international standing. Thucydides' insight reveals a sobering truth. States are rarely purely rational actors. Psychological, cultural, and reputational factors interact with material interests to produce behavior that may appear contradictory or self-defeating. Strategic planning must account not only for capabilities and objectives, but also for fear-driven escalation and honor-based imperatives that can override rational cost-benefit analysis, making conflict a persistent feature of human political systems. Beyond understanding motivations, the Peloponnesian War demonstrates how such forces drive escalation, erode restraints, and transform limited conflicts into total wars, necessitating an analysis of how protracted conflict reshapes norms, conduct, and strategic calculation. The Peloponnesian War offers a stark illustration of how prolonged conflict systematically escalates violence, erodes moral restraints, and transforms warfare into a self-perpetuating cycle of brutality. Early in the war, conventions of engagement were relatively restrained. Prisoners were generally spared, religious sanctuaries respected, and campaigning adhered to seasonal rhythms to allow harvests. Yet, as hostilities continued, these norms rapidly deteriorated. Thucydides chronicled the progressive moral collapse. The Plataea siege, 429 to 427 BCE, ended with the execution of all male defenders despite surrender. The Mytilene debate, 427 BC, nearly sanctioned mass execution before internal political debate narrowly averted it. Melos, 416 BCE, saw Athens kill all adult males and enslave women and children for refusing submission. In Antigospotami, Lysander executed thousands of Athenian prisoners without trial. This escalation followed a recognizable pattern. Initial restraint gives way to retaliation for perceived or real enemy atrocities. Each act of vengeance normalizes brutality, lowering psychological and cultural barriers to further violence. Strategic imperatives, securing resources, punishing resistance, or instilling fear, override moral considerations, while leaders advocating restraint, like Diodotus at Mytilene, face difficulty persuading populations hardened by war. Over time, violence becomes not merely permissible but incentivized, shaping conduct and expectations on both sides. Modern conflicts reflect the same dynamics. World War I, initially influenced by residual chivalric codes, escalated into unrestricted submarine warfare, chemical attacks, and strategic bombing. World War II saw deliberate targeting of civilians through the London Blitz, Hamburg firestorm, Tokyo firebombing, and ultimately atomic bombings. Vietnam illustrates gradual escalation. Limited advisory missions transformed into massive ground deployments, extensive aerial campaigns, and widespread environmental and civilian harm. In each instance, once a conflict begins, it develops an internal momentum, with initial objectives expanding and accepted methods of violence broadening. Thucydides described war as a violent teacher, Biaeos didaskalos, observing that it strips away normal life and forces individuals to adapt to brutal circumstances, often by adopting brutality themselves. The lesson is sobering. War intrinsically rewards ruthlessness and punishes restraint, making moral degradation predictable rather than exceptional. Preventing such escalation requires either extremely short conflicts, rarely achievable, or robust institutional, cultural, and legal restraints capable of surviving stress, as modern international humanitarian law attempts through codified rules like the Geneva Conventions. Yet enforcement remains tenuous when defeat looms or atrocity offers strategic advantage. The Peloponnesian War thus reveals a fundamental challenge of warfare. The longer it continues, the more civilization erodes, and the more likely participants are to commit atrocities, regardless of their initial intentions. Rapid resolution and strong institutional norms are essential to mitigate the brutalization of conflict, but absent these, escalation appears virtually inevitable, a lesson resonating from ancient Greece to contemporary battlefields. This understanding sets the stage for examining how democratic governance shapes warfare, testing whether popular assemblies and citizen armies exacerbate or restrain the pressures driving escalation and brutality. The Peloponnesian War offers the most extensive historical record for evaluating democratic governance under the extreme pressures of prolonged conflict, and the evidence is profoundly mixed. Athenian democracy displayed both remarkable resilience and catastrophic vulnerability, providing enduring lessons for scholars of political systems and strategy. Athens' democratic strengths were immediately evident. The city-state survived 27 years of continuous warfare, plague, oligarchic coups, and imperial collapse, demonstrating institutional endurance under extraordinary stress. Its naval orientation complemented democratic structures. Citizen rowers, whose livelihoods and status were tied to civic participation, were highly motivated to defend both their city and the system that empowered them. Even amidst war, Athens sustained extraordinary cultural output. Tragedy, comedy, philosophy, and monumental architecture flourished, indicating that open, participatory societies can maintain intellectual and artistic vitality under duress. Popular participation also ensured a broad sense of collective responsibility. When the assembly voted for campaigns or policy decisions, accountability was diffused, preventing elites from claiming sole blame for failures. Yet democratic weaknesses proved equally pronounced. Decision-making frequently succumbed to emotion and rhetorical manipulation rather than reasoned strategy. The Sicilian expedition exemplifies this flaw. Alcibiades' charisma and bold proposals swayed the assembly to commit half Athens' military to a distant, poorly understood theater with ambiguous objectives, overriding Nicias' cautious analysis. Later, the illegal execution of the Arginusi generals, experienced commanders eliminated for public grief and demagogic pressure, removed crucial leadership at a critical moment, illustrating the dangers of emotional policymaking. Democracy also proved vulnerable to demagogues. Figures like Cleon and Alcibiades could manipulate assemblies for personal advantage, causing abrupt policy shifts and inconsistent strategic guidance. Leadership quality strongly influenced democratic performance. Under Pericles, whose authority rested on wisdom and personal gravitas, Athens navigated complex war demands effectively. After his death, assembly volatility and declining command competence exposed democracy's structural fragility. The fundamental question emerges: did democracy fail Athens, or did Athens fail democracy by lacking institutional mechanisms to temper passion and safeguard strategic continuity? Modern democratic systems attempt to address these vulnerabilities through constitutional limits on majority power, independent judiciaries, professional military institutions insulated from direct popular control, representative structures, and separation of powers. Yet debates persist. Do such mechanisms resolve the inherent tension between public will and strategic necessity, or do they merely mask it? Contemporary democracies still wrestle with the same dilemmas, sustaining long-term commitments despite short-term political pressures, mediating public opinion shaped by media and rhetoric, and balancing immediate visibility of action against careful strategic judgment. The Peloponnesian War neither fully vindicates nor condemns democracy in military affairs. Instead, it exposes the tension inherent in allowing a polity to make existential decisions collectively. The same system that cultivates resilience, engagement, and moral legitimacy also produces inconsistency, susceptibility to manipulation, and erratic strategic outcomes. Understanding Athens' wartime democracy illuminates both the potential and the peril of popular rule. a lesson that remains deeply relevant in evaluating modern democratic states engaged in prolonged conflict. This analysis naturally leads to the broader question of how the war shaped the philosophical, moral, and historical memory of democracy, strategy, and human governance, setting the stage for an assessment of the Peloponnesian War's enduring intellectual legacy. The Peloponnesian War left an indelible mark on Greek, and subsequently Western, moral and philosophical thought by confronting civilization with stark questions about justice, power, and human nature. Central to this moral reckoning is the Melian dialogue, in which Athenian envoys explicitly dismiss appeals to morality, declaring that justice applies only between equals in power. In their blunt calculus, the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. This declaration, shocking even to contemporaries steeped in rhetoric about Greek freedom and civic virtue, exposed the naked realities of power. Athens' empire relied not on moral authority, but on coercion. Yet Thucydides' presentation frames this brutality as empirical truth rather than propaganda. The war repeatedly showed that claims of justice or liberation often masked self-interest. Sparta, for example, justified its campaigns as defending Greek freedom, only to install dicarches that were politically oppressive and economically exploitative. Neutral states like Melos faced destruction not for ethical failings, but for strategic weakness. This recognition that outcomes are determined more by power than morality profoundly influenced subsequent political philosophy. Plato's search for justice beyond conventional norms, Aristotle's nuanced analysis of ethics under imperfect circumstances, and the development of modern realist international relations theory all trace intellectual lineage to Thucydides' documentation. From a realist perspective, moral arguments cannot constrain state behavior when survival and interest are at stake. Yet alternative interpretations stress realism's self-defeating consequences. Athens' imperial overreach provoked resistance that ensured its collapse. Spartan hegemony immediately spurred renewed conflict. From this view, the war suggests that power without legitimacy proves unsustainable, and that ethical or consensual foundations are essential for enduring order. The war's brutalization revealed the fragility of civilization under sustained conflict. Episodes such as Corcyra's civil war, the Sicilian prisoners condemned to quarry death, and the mass executions at Melos illustrate a systematic erosion of ethical norms. Thucydides observed that war strips away comfort and assimilates men's characters to their conditions, implying that atrocity arises less from inherent human evil than from extreme circumstances. Yet this environmental explanation offers scant reassurance. If ordinary citizens can become instruments of brutality, what prevents recurrence in future wars? The question of whether humanity learns from history shadows the war's legacy. The Greek city-states continued internecine conflict for another century, ultimately succumbing to Macedonian conquest. Modern states, too, demonstrate repeated patterns of imperial overreach, alliance entrapment, and escalating conflict despite Thucydides' detailed warnings. This suggests either that historical lessons are intrinsically difficult to apply or that human psychology, fear, honor, ambition regularly overrides rational reflection. 20th-century political realism, particularly during the Cold War, emphasized this pessimism, framing nuclear escalation as a modern echo of ancient dynamics. Yet a more optimistic interpretation endures. Thucydides' methodology, systematic evidence gathering, analysis of causation, and candid examination of human behavior represents a deliberate attempt to enable future generations to learn from catastrophe. That his work continues to be studied over 2,400 years later implies that, even if imperfectly applied, historical wisdom remains possible. The Peloponnesian War, therefore, embodies a dual legacy. It reveals both the constancy of human nature under pressure and the enduring potential of careful historical documentation to inform moral and strategic judgment. Ultimately, the war forces a persistent question. Do humans repeat patterns of power and violence because our nature is immutable, or can deliberate study, reflection, and institutional design allow civilization to temper the destructive impulses that history so vividly exposes? This tension between determinism and learning continues to animate moral philosophy, political theory, and strategic studies, ensuring the conflict's relevance across millennia. The Peloponnesian War occupies a singular place in Western historical memory, rivaled perhaps only by the fall of Rome in terms of sustained attention and educational focus. Its endurance across millennia derives from several interrelated factors, beginning with Thucydides' extraordinary historiography. Unlike many ancient accounts preserved only in fragments, Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War survived substantially intact. Successive generations, Byzantine scholars, Islamic historians, medieval European humanists, copied, studied, and taught the text, transmitting a detailed and coherent record of the war's events, actors, and strategies. The survival of such a meticulously documented narrative ensured that knowledge of the conflict persisted far beyond Athens and Sparta's own historical moment. The war's intrinsic complexity also contributed to its lasting relevance. Unlike simple conquest tales or triumphalist epics, the Peloponnesian War encompassed multifaceted political, strategic, and social phenomena, alliance entanglements, democratic decision-making under crisis, economic warfare, imperial overreach, ideological rivalry, and escalation dynamics. These layers provide a rich analytical framework, allowing scholars and students to explore causal chains, contingency, and human behavior under stress. The ambiguous moral outcomes. Athens' democratic empire, ultimately defeated by Sparta's oligarchic hegemony, resisted straightforward heroic narratives. Unlike the Persian Wars, which offered a clear story of Greek freedom triumphing over despotism, the Peloponnesian War presented no unequivocal victors, creating ongoing interpretive challenges and debates that kept the conflict intellectually compelling. Educational institutions embedded the war into Western curricula for centuries. Renaissance humanists studied Thucydides as a model of rational, empirical historical analysis. Enlightenment thinkers debated its lessons for democracy, imperial ambition, and governance. In the 19th century, European schools used Greek history to cultivate leadership skills and civic consciousness, while American founders incorporated lessons from Greek Federation's failures into federalist debates about central authority. Military academies worldwide adopted the war as a strategic case study. West Point, Sandhurst, St. Cyr, and others teach the Sicilian expedition as a cautionary tale of overreach, the Pylos campaign as a model of exploiting enemy weakness, and Brasida's Thracian operations as exemplary economy of force maneuvers. The war's cultural significance extends beyond formal education. It appears in popular histories, novels, and documentaries, maintaining niche resonance for audiences interested in strategy and human behavior. Its relevance is periodically renewed by contemporary geopolitical parallels. Cold War strategists liken U.S.-Soviet rivalry to Athens and Sparta, while 21st-century analysts invoke the Thucydides trap in evaluating U.S.-China tensions. The Peloponnesian War thus remains a dynamic pedagogical tool, not merely a historical record. Studying it develops critical historical skills, assessing causation, evaluating source reliability, appreciating contingency, and recognizing recurring strategic patterns without assuming determinism. Ultimately, the Peloponnesian War endures because it illuminates the interplay of power, human behavior, and institutional systems in ways both specific and universal. Its lessons transcend time, providing analytical frameworks, ethical reflections, and strategic insights still applicable to contemporary governance, diplomacy, and military planning. By combining empirical rigor, narrative complexity, and philosophical resonance, it has secured its place as a canonical subject in historical memory and education worldwide. The war's educational prominence, combined with its philosophical, strategic, and cultural lessons, sets the stage for a final synthesis, explaining why the Peloponnesian War remains one of history's most consequential and enduringly relevant conflicts. The Peloponnesian War's enduring significance arises from the convergence of military, political, philosophical, historiographical, cultural, and contemporary lessons, each contributing to its lasting prominence in Western thought. Militarily, The war established patterns that recur across centuries and remain relevant to strategic studies. Imperial overreach, exemplified by Athens' Sicilian expedition, demonstrated that even dominant powers risk catastrophic defeat when extending themselves beyond logistical capacity and underestimating adversaries. Alliance entrapment, in which smaller states manipulate great powers into conflicts serving local interests, emerges repeatedly, from Roman entanglements with client states to 20th-century Cold War proxy wars. Escalation dynamics, whereby limited objectives expand and moral restraints erode under prolonged warfare, presage patterns observed in the world wars and other total conflicts. The interplay of economic warfare, targeting civilian populations and infrastructure, and combined arms innovation, foreshadowed subsequent military evolution, offering a template for analyzing both historical and modern conflicts. Recognizing these patterns enables strategic insight, even if historical lessons are inconsistently applied. Politically, the war illustrates democracy's strengths and vulnerabilities under sustained pressure. Athens' resilience, surviving plague, revolts, oligarchic coups, and catastrophic military losses demonstrates the durability of popular governance. Yet the assembly's susceptibility to demagoguery, impulsive decision-making, and inconsistent strategic judgment highlights the inherent tension between popular will and long-term strategic necessity. Questions arising from Athenian experience, whether democracies can maintain sustained commitments, require institutional checks to moderate public passion, or can make sound military decisions, remain central to contemporary debates about governance under crisis. These empirical insights provide a foundation for evaluating modern democratic performance in war. Philosophically, the war's confrontation between power and justice reshaped Western political thought. The Melian dialogue articulates realpolitik centuries before modern theorists. The strong impose their will, the weak endure it. Yet Athens' eventual collapse and the fleeting Spartan hegemony suggest limits to raw power, underscoring the enduring tension between realist and idealist interpretations of international order. Thucydides' historiography further cemented the war's legacy, creating a critical, evidence-based methodology that privileges analysis of material causation, decision-making, and behavioral patterns over myth or rhetoric. Every historian since engages, consciously or not, with his analytical framework, ensuring the war's lessons remain perpetually instructive. Culturally, the war intersected with classical Greece's apogee and decline. Periclean architecture, tragedy, comedy, and philosophy flourished even as Athens' political and military structures faltered, revealing the fragility underlying cultural brilliance. The war's devastation, population loss, economic exhaustion, and political cynicism abruptly ended this period of creative vitality, providing enduring insight into the interplay between civilizational achievement and systemic vulnerability. For contemporary audiences, the Peloponnesian War functions as an analytical prism, allowing examination of power dynamics, strategy, alliance politics, and human behavior without the partisan entanglements of modern conflicts. Its lessons are universally applicable. Democracies and oligarchies, naval and land powers, rising and established states, all confront similar dilemmas. The collapse of Athens and eventual obsolescence of Sparta illustrate the impermanence of even dominant civilizations, reminding us that human achievements require continuous stewardship and that no political, military, or cultural order is immutable. The war's significance lies not in a single moral or strategic lesson, but in its comprehensive illumination of how civilizations make choices, fight wars, govern populations, interact with allies and adversaries, and confront the limits of power and ethics. Its relevance endures precisely because it simultaneously offers empirical case studies, philosophical reflection, strategic insight, and cultural perspective. The Peloponnesian War is not merely a historical episode. It is a foundational lens for understanding the enduring patterns and dilemmas of political life, ensuring its continued study and reflection across centuries. What makes a 2,400-year-old conflict between small Greek city-states perpetually relevant, while vastly larger, more recent wars fade into obscurity? Its endurance reveals that historical events transcending immediate context illuminate permanent features of human behavior, power, and governance, timeless lessons that remain vital for military strategists, political theorists, historians, and all who seek to understand the complexities of organized human conflict.